Hi everyone and welcome back to Mr. Evan Crime Stories. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this stories involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. It was a cold December night in Austin, Texas. The year was 1991. Christmas was only a few weeks away, and the streets were beginning to carry that familiar feeling of the holiday season. Stores were decorated with lights. Families were making plans. People were finishing their Christmas shopping, and in one part of Austin, a small yogurt shop was preparing to close for the night. The business was called I Can't Believe It's Yogurt. It was an ordinary place. Bright lights, small tables, a counter where customers could order frozen yogurt. Nothing about it suggested danger. But on the evening of December 6th, 1991, 4 young girls would walk into that shop. Only one of them would ever leave alive. Their names were Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, and Amy Ayers. Jennifer was 17. Sarah was 15. Eliza was 17. Amy was 13. They were young. They had families waiting for them. They had ordinary teenage lives. And none of them knew that the final hours of their lives were approaching. At first, the evening seemed completely normal. Customers came and went. The girls worked inside the shop. The night slowly became quieter. Eventually, closing time approached. The last customers left. The girls began cleaning. Chairs were being moved. Tables were being wiped down. The shop was getting ready to close. Outside, Austin continued moving. Cars passed along the roads. People went about their Friday night. Nobody looking at the building from outside would have had any reason to think something terrible was happening inside. But investigators would later determine that the killer entered or remained near the shop around closing time, when there were no other customers present. Somewhere during those final minutes, the situation changed. The 4 girls were overpowered. They were bound with their own clothing. They were sexually assaulted. And eventually all 4 were shot. The official Austin Police Department summary states that each victim was shot in the head with a .22 caliber firearm, while Amy Ayers was also shot with a .380 caliber weapon. The building was then set on fire, but nobody outside the shop knew what was happening. The city continued its normal Friday night. Inside the yogurt shop, 4 families were unknowingly waiting for daughters who would never come home. Then the fire began. Flames spread through the building. Smoke filled the shop, and eventually, the building became the scene of one of Austin's most disturbing crimes. When firefighters arrived, they were not responding to what they initially understood to be a murder scene. They were responding to a fire. The flames had already destroyed much of the interior, but as investigators began examining what remained, they discovered something horrifying. This had not simply been a fire. 4 girls had been murdered. The victims were identified as Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, and Amy Ayers. The news spread quickly. 4 young girls, 1 small yogurt shop, 1 fire, and a killer who had disappeared into the night. At first, investigators had to determine exactly what had happened. Was the fire the cause of the deaths? Or had the girls been killed before the fire? The evidence quickly pointed toward the second possibility. The girls had been murdered before the building was set ablaze. That meant the fire had another purpose. It was not simply the result of an accident. Someone had deliberately burned the shop after the killings, and that immediately created a much larger question. Why? Was the fire intended to destroy evidence? Was it intended to hide the killer's identity? Or was there another reason? Investigators began working through the crime scene. They collected whatever evidence had survived the flames. Hair, fingerprints, other physical evidence, statements from people who had been near the shop, and the memories of customers who had been inside earlier that night. Every small detail mattered, because the killer was gone. There was no obvious suspect waiting at the scene. No confession. No clear eyewitness who could identify the person responsible. Only 4 victims and a burned building. The case would become one of the most difficult investigations in Austin history. And over the next several years, police would pursue multiple theories. They would question suspects. They would make arrests. They would obtain confessions. And eventually, some of those men would even be convicted. But the case would not end there, because the convictions would later collapse. The investigation would be criticized, and decades later, modern DNA testing would completely change the direction of the case. But on that December night, none of that had happened yet. The families were simply receiving the worst news imaginable. Their daughters were gone. Jennifer was gone. Sarah was gone. Eliza was gone. Amy was gone. And the person responsible was still free. The next morning, Austin woke up to the news. The yogurt shop had been destroyed. 4 girls had been killed. People began asking the same questions. Who did this? Why were these girls targeted? Was the killer someone they knew? Was it a random attack? Had the killer been watching the shop? And most importantly, would the person responsible ever be found? At the time, investigators had no idea that the case would remain unresolved for more than 3 decades. They also had no idea that one day, a DNA breakthrough would point toward a man who had already been dead for years. But before that discovery could happen, the investigation would take a very different path. Detectives had to begin with the people who had been connected to the shop that night. They needed to reconstruct the final hours. Who had entered the yogurt shop? Who had left? Who had seen the girls? Who had spoken to them? And who had been nearby when the shop closed? That meant talking to customers. Some witnesses remembered seeing the girls working inside. Some remembered other people at the shop. Investigators began building a timeline, minute by minute, customer by customer. The goal was to understand what happened between the last normal moments of the evening and the discovery of the fire. One customer could provide a tiny piece of information. Another could remember a vehicle. Someone else could remember a person sitting in the shop. At the time, nobody knew which detail would eventually become important. The shop itself was also important. It was not a huge building. People came in. They ordered yogurt. They sat at tables. They talked. Then they left. The girls were not working in complete isolation. Someone had seen them. Someone had been there. Someone might have noticed something unusual. But the investigation faced a major problem. The fire had destroyed part of the physical evidence. Anything that survived had to be carefully preserved, and investigators had to work with what remained. The case quickly became a race against time. The longer the killer remained unidentified, the greater the possibility that evidence would disappear. And every day that passed gave the killer more time to change his appearance, move away, or destroy anything connecting him to the crime. The victims' families, meanwhile, were living through something impossible to describe. Their daughters had gone to work. They expected them home. Instead, they were told that the girls had been murdered. There was no explanation, no warning, no obvious reason, and no person to blame. At the beginning, investigators did not know whether the attack had been planned. Perhaps the killer had entered the shop intending to rob it. Perhaps something went wrong. Perhaps the girls had resisted. Or perhaps the killer had gone there specifically to attack them. The evidence would eventually suggest a disturbing level of control. The victims had been bound. They had been sexually assaulted. They had been shot. And the building had been burned. This was not a simple accident. Someone had deliberately created chaos and then disappeared. The fire also created another problem. It could destroy evidence that might have identified the killer, but investigators still recovered enough material to keep searching. And in the years that followed, the case would produce one of the most controversial investigations in Texas criminal history. Several young men would eventually become suspects. Some would confess. Some would be convicted. But the evidence against them would later become deeply questioned. The convictions would eventually be overturned. And for years, the case would return to uncertainty. The families would have to endure the possibility that the people convicted were not the actual killers. The investigation would continue, and the killer would remain free. For Jennifer's family, for Sarah's family, for Eliza's family, for Amy's family, there was no closure. only the memory of 4 young girls whose lives had ended far too early. The yogurt shop itself became a symbol of the case, an ordinary business that had become the location of an extraordinary crime. The name of the shop would forever be connected to the 4 victims, and the date would become permanently remembered. December 6, 1991. That night, 4 girls went to work. They never came home, and for more than 30 years, their families waited for an answer. But the story did not end with the fire. It was only beginning, because investigators would soon discover that the people who had been inside the yogurt shop earlier that evening might hold the key to reconstructing the final moments. And among those witnesses was a detail that would become incredibly important decades later. 2 people, a quiet shop, a Friday night, and a timeline that investigators would eventually have to rebuild almost from scratch. The question was no longer simply, who killed the 4 girls? It was, who was inside that yogurt shop when the doors were about to close? And that question would lead investigators into a maze of witnesses, suspects, confessions, and mistakes. A maze that would last for decades. The morning after the fire, Austin was trying to understand what had happened. The yogurt shop was no longer an ordinary place of business. It was now a crime scene. Inside the burned building, investigators were searching for anything that could explain the final hours of Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, and Amy Ayers. They needed to reconstruct the night before. Not just the fire, not just the murders, every movement, every customer, every phone call, every person who had been near the shop. Because somewhere inside those final hours might be the answer. The first challenge was determining when the girls had last been seen alive. The shop had been open that evening, and customers had come and gone normally. Nothing appeared to indicate that a violent crime was about to happen. Jennifer and Sarah were sisters. Jennifer was 17. Sarah was 15. Eliza was 17. And Amy, the youngest, was 13. They were not strangers thrown together by chance. They were connected through family, friendship, school, and the ordinary routines of teenage life. That made the crime even more disturbing. There was no obvious reason for 4 girls to become victims together. Investigators therefore began asking whether the killer had specifically targeted the yogurt shop. Perhaps the person wanted money. Perhaps the person wanted to attack someone working there. Or perhaps the victims were simply caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. At first, nobody knew. The burned building made the answers harder to find. But investigators carefully examined what remained. They knew the girls had been bound. They knew they had been sexually assaulted. They knew they had been shot. And they knew the building had then been deliberately burned. That meant whoever committed the murders had taken considerable steps to conceal the crime. The killer did not simply leave. The fire suggested an attempt to destroy evidence. That immediately became one of the central ideas in the investigation. If the killer wanted to destroy evidence, then what evidence was he afraid of leaving behind? Fingerprints? Blood? DNA? Footprints? Something belonging to him? In 1991, investigators did not have the same forensic technology available today. DNA testing existed, but it was not as advanced or as widely accessible as it would become decades later. And forensic evidence recovered from a burned building could be difficult to analyze. Still, investigators collected biological material. That evidence would eventually become extremely important. But in the early days of the investigation, detectives did not know that. They were focused on finding a living suspect. They began interviewing witnesses. People who had visited the shop that night. People who lived nearby. People who worked in the surrounding area. Anyone who might have seen something unusual. The investigators needed to know what the shop looked like before the fire. Who had been inside? When did they leave? What were the girls doing? Were they alone? Had anyone behaved strangely? Had anyone been watching the building? Had anyone been hanging around outside? Every detail could potentially matter, but witnesses do not always remember events perfectly. Someone might remember a customer, but forget the exact time. Someone might remember a vehicle, but not its license plate. Someone might remember a conversation, but not the person's face. And that meant investigators had to compare different accounts. They had to build a timeline. A timeline became one of the most important tools in the case. If the investigators could establish exactly when each girl was last seen, they could narrow down the window in which the killer must have acted. The narrower that window became, the fewer possibilities there would be. But the timeline was not simple. The girls were working. Customers were coming and going. It was a Friday evening. People were moving through the area. And once the fire began, everything became chaotic. Investigators therefore had to work backward. They identified the last known customers. They examined telephone records. They spoke with people who had seen the girls. They looked at the physical condition of the building. And slowly, the final hours began to take shape. The girls had remained at the shop after most customers had left. At some point, they were attacked. The killer controlled them. They were bound. Then they were murdered. And the building was set on fire. The exact sequence remained uncertain in some details. But investigators knew the fire came after the violence. The killer had stayed long enough to carry out the attack. That raised another question. How did nobody notice? A business can be relatively quiet at closing time. But a violent attack involving 4 people would create noise. Perhaps the killer threatened them. Perhaps he surprised them. Perhaps he controlled them quickly. Or perhaps he had a weapon. Investigators had to consider all of those possibilities. They also considered the possibility that the killer knew the girls. If someone familiar entered the shop, the victims might not immediately have been suspicious. But there was no confirmed evidence that the killer was someone they knew. The possibility remained open. Then there was the issue of robbery. A robbery could explain why someone might enter a business after closing. But the violence against the girls appeared excessive if robbery had been the only goal. Still, criminals sometimes behave unpredictably. A robbery can turn violent. A victim can resist. A suspect can panic. And one crime can become another. Investigators could not rule anything out. The families, however, wanted something more immediate. They wanted names. They wanted someone responsible. And they wanted that person arrested. The pressure on investigators grew. A case involving 4 young girls was impossible to ignore. News organizations reported on the murders. The public wanted answers. The families wanted justice. And detectives knew that every day without an arrest could make the case more difficult. The investigation expanded. Detectives began looking at people with possible connections to the shop. They examined local criminals. They questioned people who had been arrested for other offenses. They investigated rumors. They looked into anyone who might have had a motive. But the evidence did not immediately point toward one clear suspect. That created a dangerous situation. When investigators do not have a suspect, they can sometimes begin focusing too heavily on theories. A person may appear suspicious for one reason. Then another piece of information is interpreted to fit that suspicion. Eventually, investigators can become convinced they have the right person even before the evidence is complete. That danger would become extremely important in this case, because eventually, police would arrest several young men, and those arrests would appear to bring the investigation to an end. But the story would not end there. Before that happened, investigators had to follow another lead. There were reports of suspicious people in the area around the yogurt shop, people who had been seen nearby, people whose stories needed to be checked. One of the challenges was that the neighborhood was active enough to produce many possible witnesses. A person could have been near the shop for completely innocent reasons. Someone walking nearby could have been going home. A car parked outside could belong to a customer. A stranger could simply have been passing through. The investigators had to determine what was meaningful and what was coincidence. Meanwhile, forensic technicians continued examining the evidence. Some biological material had survived. That material was preserved. At the time, investigators could not fully understand how valuable it might become. Decades later, technology would allow scientists to examine that evidence in ways that were impossible in 1991. But in the beginning, investigators had to rely on the tools available to them. They photographed the scene, collected physical evidence, interviewed witnesses, and began building suspect profiles. The first weeks were filled with activity. Detectives followed leads. They checked alibis. They compared statements. They searched for people who had behaved strangely. And slowly, certain names began appearing more often. Some suspects were people with criminal backgrounds. Others were young men from the area. Eventually, investigators focused on a group of teenagers. But before we reach that part of the story, there is another important question. What exactly happened to the girls during those final moments? We know they were bound. We know they were assaulted. We know they were shot. But we do not know exactly how the attack began. That uncertainty matters, because understanding the beginning could potentially reveal the killer's motive. If the attacker came in intending to rob the shop, the crime might have started one way. If he specifically targeted the girls, it might have started another. If he knew one of the victims, the situation could have been different again. Unfortunately, the fire destroyed much of the evidence that might have answered that question. The killer had created an environment in which evidence could disappear, and investigators had to work with whatever remained. The case therefore became a race between the evidence and time. The families wanted answers. The police wanted an arrest, and the killer remained unidentified. But investigators were not giving up. They began searching for anyone who might have seen suspicious activity near the shop. One witness could change everything. One statement could identify a vehicle. One piece of physical evidence could connect a suspect. And one confession could end the investigation. Eventually, investigators would receive information that pointed them toward a group of young men. Their names would become closely connected with the case. They would be questioned. They would give statements. And eventually some would confess. At first, those confessions would appear to provide the breakthrough everyone had been waiting for. The families might finally have answers. The police might finally have their killers. The public might finally know who was responsible. But there was a problem. The confessions would not remain reliable. Questions would arise about how they had been obtained. Evidence would be challenged. And eventually the convictions would collapse. The case would return to uncertainty. For the families, that meant years of hope followed by another devastating disappointment. The people they had been told were responsible might not have been the real killers. And if they were not, then the real killer was still out there. That possibility would haunt the investigation. But at this point, detectives were still far from that realization. In the early investigation, they believed they were getting closer. They began looking more closely at a small group of teenagers. The young men were connected to Austin. They knew the area. They had been involved in criminal activity, and investigators believed they might have information about the murders. One of the suspects was Robert Springsteen. Another was Michael Scott. Their names would eventually become central to the case. But before they were arrested, detectives had to build their case. They questioned them. They compared their statements. They looked for contradictions. They tried to determine where they had been on the night of December 6th. And eventually, investigators believed they had found the people responsible. The arrests came several years after the murders. By then, the case had already become one of Austin's most notorious unsolved crimes. The families had spent years waiting. The public had spent years asking questions. And suddenly, police were saying they had answers. But the story was only entering its most controversial stage. Because the question would soon become, were these really the men who killed the 4 girls? Or had investigators become convinced by evidence that would later prove unreliable? The answer would not come quickly. It would take years. And before the truth could begin to emerge, the suspects would face one of the most important moments in the investigation. They would confess. And those confessions would appear to tell investigators exactly what happened inside the yogurt shop. But eventually, almost everything about those confessions would be questioned. For several years, the yogurt shop murders remained without a clear answer. 4 young girls had been killed. The shop had been burned, and the person responsible was still unknown. Then investigators began focusing on a group of young men from Austin. Among them were Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott. At first, neither name meant anything to the families. They were simply suspects in a case that had already consumed years of investigation. But detectives believed there was a connection. They began questioning the men. They examined their backgrounds. They compared their statements with what investigators believed had happened inside the yogurt shop. And eventually, the investigation took a dramatic turn. A confession emerged. Springsteen reportedly admitted involvement in the murders. For investigators, this seemed like the breakthrough they had been waiting for. A confession could explain the crime. It could provide details that only the killer would know. And it could finally give the families an answer. But a confession is not automatically proof. Investigators still need to determine whether the details are independently supported by evidence. That distinction would become extremely important. At the time, however, the confession created enormous momentum. The case suddenly appeared to have a direction. Springsteen was arrested. The prosecution prepared its case, and the families were told that the person responsible might finally be held accountable. But questions soon began appearing. How had the confession been obtained? What exactly had been said? Were the details consistent with the physical evidence? And did the confession contain information that had not already been made public? Those questions would eventually become central to the case. The investigation did not stop with Springsteen. Michael Scott was also implicated. According to the prosecution's theory, the two men had been involved in the murders. The case against them would eventually become one of the most controversial parts of the entire investigation. But before the legal battle began, investigators had to understand what had happened inside the yogurt shop. The prosecution's theory was that the men had entered the business, overpowered the girls, assaulted them, killed them, and then started the fire. It was a horrifying scenario, and it seemed to fit the physical evidence. The girls had been bound. They had been assaulted. They had been shot. The shop had burned. But investigators still needed to prove that the suspects had been there. That was where the confessions became important. If the suspects had described details that only the killer could know, the confession would be powerful evidence. But if the details had been supplied by investigators during questioning, the confession would be much weaker. The defense would later argue that the confessions were unreliable. The circumstances surrounding the interrogations would become heavily scrutinized, and eventually, courts would have to consider whether the convictions could stand. But in the early stages, investigators believed they had finally solved the case. The news brought a mixture of relief and pain. For the victims' families, an arrest meant that someone might finally be held accountable. But it also meant reopening the details of the murders. They had to hear what investigators believed had happened. They had to revisit the final hours of their daughters' lives. And they had to face the possibility that the people accused of killing them might never leave prison. The prosecution moved forward. Springsteen was eventually tried. The case received enormous attention. The public had already been fascinated by the murders. Now I was a suspect, a courtroom, a prosecution, and a chance for a verdict. The evidence included the confession, but the defense questioned its reliability. They argued that investigators had put pressure on the suspect. They challenged the circumstances under which the statement had been made, and they questioned whether the confession matched the physical evidence. This was not simply a disagreement over one sentence. It was a question of whether the confession could be trusted at all. Because if the confession was unreliable, the prosecution's case became much weaker. The jury nevertheless convicted Springsteen. He was sentenced to death. For many people, the case appeared to be over. A killer had been identified. A conviction had been obtained. The families could finally begin to believe that justice had been done. But the story did not end. Springsteen's conviction was eventually overturned. The reasons included serious concerns about the confession and the circumstances surrounding the interrogation. The case was becoming something entirely different. It was no longer simply a murder investigation. It was becoming a debate about wrongful convictions. Could an innocent person confess to a crime? Could investigators become convinced they had the right suspect? Could a confession appear convincing even if it was false? And if the wrong person had been convicted, where was the real killer? These questions became increasingly important. Michael Scott's case followed a similar path. He was also convicted, but his conviction was later overturned. The legal process continued for years, and eventually both men were released. The families were left with a terrible possibility. What if the people they had been told were responsible were not the killers? What if the case had taken a wrong turn? What if the real killer had been free all along? For the families, that was devastating. They had spent years believing the investigation had finally produced an answer. Now that answer was being questioned. The case returned to the starting point. For girls had been murdered. The yogurt shop had been burned, and the identity of the killer remained uncertain. But something important had survived. Physical evidence. Evidence that had been collected in 1991. Biological material that investigators had preserved. At the time, it had not produced a definitive answer. But technology was changing. DNA science was developing rapidly. The same evidence that had once been difficult to analyze could eventually become far more valuable. This would become one of the most important developments in the entire case. But it would take decades. Before that happened, investigators had to deal with the aftermath of the overturned convictions. The original investigation was examined again. Questions were raised about the confessions. Questions were raised about the suspects. And questions were raised about whether investigators had pursued other possibilities thoroughly enough. The case became an example of how difficult a major investigation can become when early assumptions take hold. Once investigators believed Springsteen and Scott were responsible, evidence could be interpreted through that theory. Details that seemed to support it became important. Details that did not fit could be questioned. This is known as confirmation bias. It can happen in any investigation. Once a theory becomes dominant, investigators may unconsciously look for evidence that confirms it. That does not mean the investigators were acting dishonestly. It means that human beings naturally prefer explanations that fit what they already believe. The yogurt shop case would eventually demonstrate how dangerous that can be. The original investigators believed they had solved the crime, but the courts eventually disagreed with the reliability of the convictions. And now the case was open again. For the victims' families, the reopening meant another long wait, another investigation, another possibility that the person responsible might never be found. But there was one difference this time. Technology had changed. DNA analysis had become much more powerful. Investigators could revisit old biological evidence. They could compare genetic material against known suspects. They could search databases, and they could potentially identify a person who had never been considered during the original investigation. The old evidence had not disappeared. It had simply been waiting. For years, scientists had been improving their ability to extract information from tiny biological samples. The same kind of evidence that investigators in 1991 could only partially understand could now potentially provide a genetic profile, and that profile could be compared with suspects. The question became, was there enough usable DNA left from the crime scene? If there was, the case might finally have a path forward. But investigators had to be careful. DNA evidence is powerful, yet it must be properly collected, preserved, analyzed, and interpreted. A DNA match can be extremely significant, but investigators still need to understand how the DNA got there. Was the person actually present during the crime? Could the material have been transferred? Was the sample contaminated? These questions matter. In the yogurt shop case, however, the possibility of obtaining a genetic profile was extraordinary. The murders had happened more than 20 years earlier. The original suspects had already been released. The original investigation had been questioned, and the case remained unsolved. Then, in the years that followed, forensic scientists began testing the biological evidence. A DNA profile was developed from material recovered from the crime scene. It belonged to an unknown male. That was a major breakthrough. The investigators now had something they had not had before. A genetic identity. Not a name. Not yet, but a biological profile. The profile could be compared against known individuals. And if the person was already in a DNA database, the investigators might find a match. But there was no immediate match. The unknown male did not simply appear in the database. The case remained open. Still, investigators now had a target. They knew the crime scene contained DNA from an unidentified male. That meant future advances in forensic genealogy and database technology might eventually help identify him. For the first time, the case had a kind of evidence that could survive decades. The biological material did not care how much time had passed. If the DNA remained usable, the truth might still be recoverable. The families had waited for years. Now science offered a new possibility, but they would have to wait again. The investigation was entering another long period of uncertainty, and somewhere in that uncertainty was a man whose DNA had been left behind. A man who might have known what happened inside the yogurt shop. A man who might have been connected to the 4 murders. And a man whose identity had remained hidden for decades. The investigators had his genetic profile. They just did not have his name. Yet. And the next breakthrough would come from an unexpected direction. Instead of starting with the old suspects, investigators would begin using the DNA itself. They would search, compare, analyze, and eventually they would find a name belonging to a man who was no longer alive. Chapter 4: The DNA that waited. For years, the yogurt shop murders remained trapped in the past. The fire was long gone. The original investigation had ended in controversy. The men once convicted had been released, and the families were still waiting for justice. But something had survived from that terrible night. Tiny traces of biological evidence. Evidence that could not speak in 1991. But decades later, science had changed. DNA analysis had become one of the most powerful tools in criminal investigations. And investigators began looking again at the evidence from the yogurt shop. They developed a DNA profile from biological material recovered from the crime scene. The profile belonged to an unknown male. That was a major breakthrough. For the first time, investigators had something that could potentially identify the person connected to the evidence without relying on a confession. But there was an immediate problem. The unknown man's DNA did not produce an obvious match. His identity remained hidden. The investigators had a genetic profile. They simply did not know whose profile it was. The case therefore remained open. Years passed. Then technology advanced again. Investigators began using more sophisticated methods to compare DNA evidence. Eventually, the search led them toward a man named Robert Eugene Brazier. Brazier had lived in Austin around the time of the murders. He had also been a teenager in 1991. But by the time investigators connected his name to the case, he was already dead. Brazier had died in 1999. That created an unusual situation. Investigators could not simply bring him in for questioning. They could not compare his DNA through a voluntary sample. He was gone. The only way to determine whether he was connected to the crime was through other biological evidence. Investigators eventually obtained DNA from Brazier's remains. The comparison produced a significant result. His genetic profile was consistent with the unknown male DNA recovered in the investigation. But this was not the end. Investigators still had to understand exactly what the DNA meant. A DNA connection can be extremely powerful evidence, but the context matters. Investigators had to determine whether the biological material was genuinely connected to the murders. They also had to determine whether the DNA could have been transferred in another way. The investigation continued carefully. Then came another important development. In 2025, Austin police announced what they described as a major breakthrough in the case. Using genetic genealogy and additional forensic work, investigators connected the DNA profile to Robert Eugene Brazier. According to police, Brazier was believed to be one of the men connected to the crime scene. But there was an important limitation. Brazier was dead, and investigators could not establish from the DNA evidence alone exactly what role he played in the murders. That distinction is crucial. The DNA connection was significant, but it did not automatically answer every question. It did not tell investigators exactly how the murders unfolded. It did not explain every detail inside the yogurt shop, and it did not necessarily establish whether Brazier acted alone. There could have been other people involved. There could have been other evidence that had not yet been discovered, and investigators still had to examine the entire case. But after more than 30 years, the name of a possible participant had finally emerged. For the families, this was an extraordinary moment. They had waited decades. Some family members had died without knowing who was responsible. Others had spent their entire adult lives carrying the memory of that night. Now finally there was a name. Robert Brazier. A name that had not been part of the original public story. A man who had been a teenager at the time of the murders. And a man who had died years before the DNA breakthrough. The discovery also changed the way people looked at the old investigation. The original suspects had been convicted. Their convictions had later been overturned. The real investigation had remained uncertain. Now modern science was pointing toward someone else. That did not necessarily mean every earlier investigator had acted improperly. It showed how much information can remain hidden when technology is limited. In 1991, investigators could not perform the kind of genetic genealogy that would later become possible. They could not search family connections through large DNA databases in the same way. They could not use the same computational tools. The evidence was there, but the technology needed to interpret it was not. That is one of the most remarkable aspects of cold cases. Sometimes the evidence does not change. Science does. A piece of biological material can remain untouched for decades. Then, suddenly new technology can reveal information that investigators could never see before. The yogurt shop case became an example of that, but there was still a major question. Why was Brazier connected to the crime? Investigators looked into his background. He had been living in Austin in 1991. He was reportedly known to have been involved with drugs and criminal activity. But a criminal history alone does not prove involvement in murder. Investigators needed more. They needed to determine where he was around the time of the murders. They needed to examine his connections. They needed to see whether he had known the victims. And they needed to understand whether there was evidence connecting him directly to the yogurt shop. This is where the investigation became more complicated. The DNA evidence could identify a person, but a complete case requires a timeline, a motive, a connection, and evidence showing what happened. The families had waited too long for investigators to make another mistake. They wanted certainty, not another theory, not another confession, not another conviction that could later collapse. They wanted evidence that would survive scrutiny, and this time, investigators had something they had not had before: DNA. But even DNA could not answer every question. Suppose Brazier's DNA was present at the scene. That would indicate a biological connection. But how did it get there? Was he inside the yogurt shop during the murders? Was the biological material deposited during the crime? Was it transferred through another person? Could it have been deposited before the murders? Investigators had to consider those possibilities. The exact location and circumstances of the biological evidence therefore mattered. This is why forensic investigations cannot simply stop at the words DNA match. The science must be connected to the circumstances, the timeline, the scene, the witnesses, everything. Investigators therefore continued examining the old evidence, and the case began to look very different from the one investigators had prosecuted decades earlier. The earlier suspects had been tied to the crime largely through confessions and other investigative evidence. Now there was a biological trail pointing somewhere else. The implications were enormous. If Brazier was involved, then the original investigation had missed him. And if he was not the only person involved, there could still be another unidentified person connected to the murders. That possibility meant the case was not necessarily finished. In fact, it might have been entering another phase. Investigators now had to ask, who else was there? The 4 girls had been killed, the building had been burned, and the crime appeared to involve more than one stage. Someone had to enter the shop. Someone had to control the victims. Someone had to carry out the killings. And someone had to start the fire. It could have been one person. It could have been several. The evidence did not immediately answer that question. The families were therefore left with mixed emotions. There was finally a major development. But there was also another layer of uncertainty. The man whose DNA had been connected to the crime was already dead. There would be no trial, no courtroom, no opportunity for prosecutors to question him, no opportunity for a jury to hear his side, no chance to ask him what happened. The investigation had found a name, but it could not bring that person to justice. For some family members, that was frustrating. For others, simply knowing who might have been connected to the crime was meaningful. After decades of uncertainty, even a partial answer could matter. But the families still wanted the entire truth. They wanted to know what happened to Jennifer, what happened to Sarah, what happened to Eliza, what happened to Amy, and they wanted to know why. The investigation continued. Police announced that they were still examining evidence and possible accomplices. They did not simply close the file because one man's identity had been established. That was important. A cold case should not end merely because investigators discover one significant clue. They have to determine whether the clue explains the whole crime. And in this case, there were still unanswered questions. What was Brazier's exact role? Was he physically present during the murders? Was he one of the people who attacked the girls? Did he help start the fire? Was he acting with another person? And if so, who? Those questions remain part of the investigation. The DNA breakthrough also brought attention back to the original convictions. Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott had spent years carrying the burden of being identified as the killers. Their convictions had eventually been overturned. Now, decades later, investigators were pointing toward someone else. The story demonstrated how dangerous it can be to treat a confession as the final answer. A confession can be powerful, but a confession must be tested against independent evidence. The yogurt shop case showed why. The biological evidence had survived, and decades later, it pointed investigators in a different direction. This was not the ending anyone had expected, but it was the kind of breakthrough that families of cold case victims dream about. A new name, a new lead, a new possibility, and perhaps, finally, a path toward the truth. Yet the investigation still had a long way to go. The name Robert Brazier did not explain everything. It did not tell investigators whether he acted alone. It did not provide a complete timeline, and it could not answer the questions that had haunted the families since 1991. But it changed one thing forever. The case was no longer trapped entirely in the past. Modern science had reached back into that December night, and for the first time, it had brought investigators closer to a person whose DNA was connected to the evidence. A person who had once walked through Austin as a teenager. A person who had lived for years after the murders. And a person who had died before anyone knew his name might become part of one of the city's most notorious cases. The girls' families had waited more than 30 years. Now they finally had something tangible. But the mystery was not finished. Because knowing who may have left DNA at the scene is not the same as knowing exactly what happened. There were still unanswered questions, and one of the biggest was whether another person had been involved. The investigation would have to look beyond the name, beyond the DNA, beyond the old convictions. It would have to return to the crime itself, the final hours of the four girls, the fire, the evidence, and the people who may have been nearby. Because somewhere in those details could be the missing piece. And after more than 3 decades, the families were closer to that piece than they had ever been. But they still did not have the complete story. For more than 3 decades, the identity connected to the DNA evidence remained unknown. Investigators had a biological profile. They had the evidence from the crime scene, but they did not have a name. That changed in 2025. After years of additional forensic work, the Austin Police Department announced that investigators had identified Robert Eugene Brasher's as a suspect in the 1991 yogurt shop murders. Police said the identification came through extensive DNA testing and that Brasher's had died by suicide in 1999. For the families, the announcement was enormous. 34 years had passed since Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy were murdered. 34 years of questions. 34 years of wondering whether the person responsible would ever be identified. And suddenly there was a name, Robert Eugene Brasher's. But even this breakthrough did not immediately provide every answer. Brasher's was already dead. There would be no interrogation, no courtroom confession, no opportunity for investigators to ask him what happened inside the yogurt shop. And perhaps most importantly, the police still had to determine exactly what role he played. The DNA connection was significant. But investigators could not simply stop there. They had to reconstruct the story again. Who was Brasher's? Where had he been in 1991? What was he doing in Austin? Did he know the victims? Was he connected to the yogurt shop? And was he acting alone? These questions suddenly became more important than ever. Brasher's had been a teenager around the time of the murders. He was living in Austin, and later investigations into his DNA connected him to other serious crimes committed in different states. According to an Austin Police Department case summary, his genetic profile was also linked to several other unsolved crimes, including a 1997 sexual assault in Memphis and the 1998 murders of a mother and daughter in Missouri. That information was disturbing. It suggested that Brasher's may have had a violent criminal history that investigators in Austin did not fully understand in 1991. But it was still important to keep the evidence separate. A person's involvement in one crime does not automatically prove involvement in another. Each case requires its own evidence. The yogurt shop murders were no exception. Investigators therefore continued examining the original evidence. They looked at the DNA. They reviewed old reports. They reconsidered the timeline. And they went back through the history of the investigation. This was not simply about finding a name. It was about understanding what had gone wrong. The original investigation had produced 4 suspects. 2 had been convicted. Those convictions were eventually overturned. The charges against the other two men were also dropped. By 2026, the city of Austin was involved in a proposed settlement related to claims arising from those arrests and convictions, totaling up to $35 million. City documents describe the earlier cases as wrongful arrests and convictions and state that Brasher's was identified as the suspect in 2025. That development added another painful layer to the story. For years, innocent men had carried the consequences of an investigation that had pointed in the wrong direction. Meanwhile, the actual person now connected to the crime had never faced prosecution. He had died years earlier. The families therefore received something they had desperately wanted, a possible answer, but not the kind of justice that usually comes with a criminal trial. There would be no verdict, no sentence, no opportunity for the victims' families to sit across from the accused in a courtroom. Only the evidence, and the evidence pointed toward a man who was no longer alive. Still, the discovery mattered, because the case had finally moved away from speculation. For decades, people had wondered whether the killer might be one of the men who had been arrested. Now investigators had forensic evidence pointing somewhere else. The old theory had changed, and that change raised an uncomfortable question. How had the original investigation gone so wrong? The answer is complicated. Investigators in the early 1990s were working with the technology and information available at the time. They had witnesses, they had statements, they had suspects, and eventually they had confessions. But the case demonstrates why those things must always be tested against physical evidence. A confession can sound convincing. A suspect can appear suspicious. A witness can seem certain. But if the physical evidence tells a different story, investigators have to listen. In the yogurt shop case, DNA eventually became that independent voice. It did not care about old theories. It did not care about previous convictions. It simply provided biological information. And that information pointed investigators toward someone who had not been at the center of the original prosecution. The discovery also gave investigators another opportunity. They could now examine other crimes connected to Brasher's. Perhaps those cases could reveal patterns. Perhaps they could show how he operated. Perhaps they could explain how he behaved around victims. And perhaps they could help investigators understand what happened in Austin. But again, caution was necessary. Similar crimes do not automatically mean the same person committed them. Investigators needed evidence, and they continued looking. Meanwhile, the families were faced with a difficult reality. They finally had a name, but they still did not have a complete explanation. They still wanted to know exactly what happened to the four girls. Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, Amy. The victims were not simply four names in a police report. They were daughters, sisters, friends, students, young women who had gone to work on a normal Friday evening. They should have returned home. Instead, their families spent decades waiting for answers. Now, more than 30 years later, investigators were telling them that a deceased man had been identified as a suspect. For some families, that could bring a sense of relief. For others, it might raise even more questions, because identifying a suspect is not the same as understanding the crime. There was still the fire. Why was the building burned? Was it intended to destroy evidence? Was it part of the original plan? And what happened between the moment the girls began closing the shop and the moment the fire was discovered? Those questions remained important. Investigators had to go back to the beginning. They had to examine the final customers. They had to examine the timeline. They had to look at the physical evidence again. And they had to determine whether Brasher's could be placed at the shop during the critical period. The case was no longer simply a cold case. It was becoming a reconstruction. 34 years after the murders, investigators were trying to rebuild one night from fragments. Fragments of DNA, old witness statements, crime scene records, photographs, and memories. The difficulty was that time had changed everything. People had moved. Some witnesses had died. Some memories had faded. The original investigators had retired, and the suspect himself was dead. There was no way to simply go back and ask everyone the same questions. The investigation had to work with what remained. That is one of the cruel realities of cold cases. Time can preserve evidence, but it can also destroy context. A piece of DNA may survive perfectly. A witness's memory may not. A document may remain, but the person who created it may be gone. The yogurt shop murders contained both kinds of evidence. Some physical evidence had survived, but many of the people connected to the original investigation had moved on or died. Still, investigators continued. The breakthrough had given them a direction, and for the first time in decades, the direction was based on forensic evidence. That alone was significant. But then another question emerged. Was Brasher's the only person involved? Police have described him as a suspect. The investigation remains open. That means the story should not be treated as though every question has already been answered. There may have been other people. There may have been an accomplice. Or Brasher's may have acted alone. The evidence has not publicly established every detail, and that uncertainty is important, because true crime stories often end the moment a suspect is named. But real investigations do not work that way. A suspect is the beginning of another investigation. Detectives still have to establish what the person did, how they did it, when they did it, and whether anyone else was involved. The yogurt shop case is still in that process. The Austin Police Department has said the investigation remains open and ongoing. That means the final answer has not yet been written. There may still be evidence that has not been publicly explained. There may still be witnesses who know something. There may still be connections between Brasher's and people who were around Austin in 1991. And there may still be unanswered questions about the fire. The families have waited a very long time. But now there is finally something they did not have before. A forensic trail, a name, and a direction. For decades, the killer had been a shadow, an unknown person whose identity could only be guessed. Now, investigators had a person whose DNA was connected to the case. And even though he was gone, his identity gave investigators the opportunity to look backward, to examine his life, his movements, his relationships, his criminal history, and the other crimes connected to his genetic profile. The past was no longer completely silent. It was beginning to speak. But the story still had another question. What exactly happened inside the yogurt shop before the fire? Because knowing who may have left DNA does not automatically explain the final moments of 4 young women. The investigators still needed to reconstruct those moments. And perhaps the most important place to look was the timeline. Who was the last customer? Who was the last person to see the girls alive? Who left the area before the fire? And who remained nearby? Those questions had been asked in 1991. But now investigators could ask them again with a completely different understanding of the case. The old investigation had been built around suspects. The new investigation could be built around evidence. And perhaps that difference would finally reveal what happened. The families had waited for decades. Now they had a reason to believe that the case might finally be moving toward the truth. But the truth was still incomplete. The name Robert Eugene Brasher's answered one question. It did not answer them all. And the next question was perhaps the most important one. Was he alone? Because if another person had been involved, then even the 2025 breakthrough would only be the beginning. And if someone else knew what happened inside that yogurt shop, that person might still be alive. For years, the yogurt shop murders had been surrounded by uncertainty. There had been suspects. There had been confessions. There had been convictions. And then there had been exonerations. But none of those things had answered the most important question. Who actually killed the 4 girls? The families had waded through one investigation after another. Then, decades later, forensic science began changing the case. The evidence that had been collected in 1991 was still there, and one particular piece of evidence would become extremely important. DNA recovered from material associated with the victims was tested again using more advanced methods. One of the most significant results came from Amy Ayres. Investigators were able to obtain a usable DNA profile from her fingernail clippings. The profile was compared directly with the DNA profile associated with Robert Eugene Brasher's. The result was a match. According to Austin police, the probability of a randomly selected unrelated person being the contributor was approximately 1 in 2.5 million. For investigators, this was a major development. It meant the connection was not simply based on a confession. It was not based on a witness saying that someone looked suspicious. It was biological evidence, evidence that had survived for more than 3 decades. But investigators did not stop there. They continued examining the case. because one DNA result can point investigators in a direction. A complete investigation has to determine what that direction means. They needed to know whether Brasher's had actually been in Austin in 1991. They needed to examine his history. They needed to compare other evidence. And they needed to understand whether he could have committed the entire crime alone. Then another piece of evidence became important. A shell casing from the Austin crime scene was compared with evidence from a later murder in Kentucky. The ballistic evidence connected the same firearm to the Kentucky case. And that case also involved Brasher's. The pieces were beginning to fit together. DNA, ballistics, location, history, and timing. None of these details should be viewed in isolation. But together, they created a much stronger picture. The man investigators had identified was no longer simply a name produced by a DNA search. There was additional evidence connecting him to violent crimes. According to investigators, Brasher's had also been linked to other murders and sexual assaults in different states. That history was disturbing, but investigators still had to be careful. A person's past does not automatically prove guilt in a particular case. Every crime must be established through its own evidence. And that was exactly what investigators were now attempting to do. They went back through the original evidence. They examined the ammunition. They examined the DNA. They reviewed the old investigation. And they looked at the pattern of the crime. One detail stood out. The victims had been bound using clothing. Brasher's had been associated with similar methods in other violent crimes. The victims had been sexually assaulted. There were similarities with other cases connected to him. And fires had also appeared in the circumstances of some of those crimes. Again, these similarities did not by themselves prove that Brasher's committed the Austin murders, but they provided investigators with another piece of context. The investigation was becoming more coherent. For more than 30 years, the case had seemed to contain disconnected fragments. Now some of those fragments were beginning to connect. The old evidence was being interpreted with modern tools. The unidentified DNA profile now had a likely source. The ballistic evidence pointed toward the same man, and his history showed a pattern that investigators could examine. But there was still one major problem. Robert Brasher's was dead. He had died in 1999 during a police standoff. That meant there could be no arrest, no interrogation, no trial, and no opportunity to confront him with the evidence. The investigators had identified a likely perpetrator more than 25 years after his death. For the families, this was both significant and painful. They finally had a name, but they could never ask him. Why? They could never ask. What happened inside the yogurt shop? They could never ask. Were you alone? And they could never hear him explain what happened to Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy. Those questions would remain unanswered. Still, investigators believed they had enough evidence to identify Brasher's as the likely perpetrator. Austin police announced the breakthrough publicly in September 2025. They emphasized that the investigation remained open and ongoing. That wording mattered. The police were not saying every mystery had been solved. They were saying that a major breakthrough had occurred. There was a difference. The case had moved forward, but it was not necessarily finished. Investigators still wanted information. They still wanted to understand the full circumstances, and they still wanted anyone with knowledge of the case to come forward. Meanwhile, the discovery changed the lives of people who had spent years believing the wrong men were responsible. Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott had been convicted after investigators obtained confessions. Their convictions were later overturned. The DNA evidence ultimately cleared them, and in 2025, the case against the original suspects was finally viewed through an entirely different lens. They had spent years living under the weight of accusations for a crime they maintained they did not commit. Now modern forensic evidence pointed toward another man. The contrast was difficult to ignore. In the 1990s, investigators had relied heavily on confessions. In the 2020s, investigators were relying on DNA and ballistics. The difference demonstrated how much forensic investigation had changed. It also showed why old cases can sometimes be solved decades later. The evidence does not always disappear. Sometimes it waits. A tiny biological sample can remain preserved. A shell casing can remain stored. A photograph can remain in an evidence file. And years later, a new technology can make that old evidence speak. The yogurt shop case had become exactly that kind of investigation. The past had left behind clues. Modern science was finally learning how to read them. But there was another question that investigators had to confront. Could Brashers have acted alone? This question mattered because 4 girls had been attacked. They had been bound. They had been assaulted. They had been shot. And the building had been burned. The crime required control, planning, and time. It was possible that one person could have done it. It was also possible that someone else had helped. Investigators therefore examined whether there was evidence of an accomplice. At the time of the 2025 announcement, officials said they believed Brashers was the likely sole perpetrator, while the investigation continued. That conclusion was significant. It meant investigators were not simply looking for another unknown killer. They believed the evidence pointed primarily toward Brashers. But they still wanted to verify the circumstances, because the families had already endured one investigation that produced the wrong people. Nobody wanted another premature conclusion. The case had to be handled differently this time. Evidence first, theory second, and every conclusion had to be supported. That was especially important because the 4 girls deserved more than another uncertain answer. Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, Amy Ayers. Their families had waited more than 30 years. They had watched the case move through courts. They had watched suspects be convicted. They had watched those convictions collapse. And then they had waited again. Now finally science had given them something different. Not a confession, not a rumor, not a witness who remembered something decades later. A genetic connection, a biological link, and a ballistic connection. The investigation had finally reached a point where the evidence was speaking for itself. But there was still something haunting about the timing. Brashers had been alive when the families were still searching. He had been alive when the original suspects were arrested. He had been alive when the first trials took place. He had been alive when the convictions were handed down. And yet he died in 1999. The truth about his possible connection to the yogurt shop murders would not emerge until decades later. That meant he took his own explanation to the grave. And investigators would have to reconstruct the truth without him. That is one of the most frustrating aspects of the case. Even when modern science identifies a likely perpetrator, it cannot always recover the missing story. DNA can say, this person's genetic material is connected to the evidence. Ballistics can say, this weapon is connected to another crime. But neither can necessarily explain every minute of a murder. For that, investigators need witnesses, records, statements, and sometimes a confession. In this case, the one person who might have provided that confession was already dead. So the investigation had to continue through evidence, piece by piece. The DNA, the firearm, the timeline, the location, the history, the similarities, and the circumstances of the crime. Together, they created a much clearer picture than investigators had in 1991. But there was still another layer to the story, the wrongfully accused men. Because while the new investigation was identifying Brashers, another chapter of the case was unfolding in court. A chapter about the men who had been accused decades earlier. Men who had spent years fighting to clear their names. Men whose lives had been permanently changed by the investigation. And eventually, the courts would formally recognize what the DNA evidence had already suggested. They had been wrongfully accused. The story of the yogurt shop murders was therefore no longer only about 4 murdered girls. It had become a story about forensic science, investigative mistakes, false confessions, wrongful convictions, and the possibility of finally identifying the real perpetrator. That made the case even more complicated, because solving a murder is not only about identifying a killer. It is also about understanding how the investigation reached the wrong conclusion in the first place. What went wrong? Why were those men believed? Why were the confessions trusted? Why did investigators not identify Brashers earlier? And could the tragedy have been resolved decades sooner if the evidence had been interpreted differently? These are difficult questions, and some may never have complete answers. But the new forensic evidence changed the central story. The case was no longer simply 4 girls murdered, unknown killer. It had become 4 girls murdered, wrong men accused. Decades later, forensic evidence points toward a different man. That was a remarkable change. And yet, one final question remained. If Brasher's was responsible, what exactly happened during the final minutes inside the yogurt shop? How did he gain control of the girls? Why did he kill them? Why did he set the building on fire? And what happened immediately afterward? Those questions would take investigators back to the night itself. Back to December 6, 1991. Back to the closing hours. Back to the small yogurt shop where 4 girls had gone to work. And back to the moment when an ordinary Friday night became one of Austin's darkest mysteries. Because now that investigators had a possible identity, they could look at those final moments in a completely different way. The evidence was no longer pointing toward a group of teenagers who had been convicted years earlier. It was pointing toward a man who had escaped suspicion for decades. And perhaps the final pieces of the story were still waiting inside the old investigation files. For the families of Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, and Amy Ayers, the discovery of new DNA evidence changed more than the identity of a possible killer. It forced the entire history of the case to be examined again. For years, 2 men had carried the burden of being publicly identified as the killers. Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott. Their names had become permanently connected to the murders. But they had always maintained that they were innocent. And eventually, the evidence would support them. To understand why the yogurt shop case remained unresolved for so long, we have to go back to the investigation that followed the original murders. The police had been under enormous pressure. 4 teenage girls had been brutally murdered. The public wanted someone responsible. The families wanted justice. And investigators needed an answer. Eventually, detectives focused on a group of young men. Springsteen and Scott became central suspects. Investigators believed they had information about the murders. Then came the confessions. At the time, those confessions appeared devastating. A confession can be one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in a criminal investigation. If someone admits to a murder and provides details that only the killer could know, investigators may believe they have finally found the truth. But the reliability of these confessions was later challenged. The circumstances surrounding the interrogations became a major issue. And when DNA testing became available, the biological evidence did not support the convictions. The men who had been accused were not connected to the crime scene DNA. That changed everything. The case was no longer simply about whether they were guilty. It became a question of whether the investigation itself had gone badly wrong. Springsteen had been convicted and sentenced to death. Michael Scott had also been convicted, but both convictions were eventually overturned. The men were released after years of fighting the accusations, and the families were once again left without an answer. The person they had been told was responsible might not have been responsible after all. Then there were 2 other men who had also been accused in connection with the case. Forrest Wellborn and Maurice Pierce. Neither was ultimately convicted of the murders. Pierce spent years under the shadow of the accusation and died in 2010. Wellborn continued to maintain his innocence. Decades later, a Texas judge formally declared all 4 men innocent in 2025. For the men and their families, that ruling was important. But it could not give them back the years they had lost. It could not erase the suspicion that had followed them. And it could not undo the damage caused by being accused of one of the most notorious crimes in Austin history. Meanwhile, the real investigation had continued. The old DNA evidence remained. And eventually, modern forensic technology provided a completely different direction. Robert Eugene Brasher's, a man who had not been the focus of the original prosecution, a man who had been alive during the original investigation, and a man whose DNA eventually connected him to evidence from the crime scene. The discovery was extraordinary, because it meant the case had not simply been solved by finding a new witness. It had been changed by evidence that had been sitting there for decades. The DNA had existed. The investigators simply did not have the technology needed to fully use it. That is one of the most fascinating parts of the case. In 1991, forensic science could not answer every question. In the years that followed, DNA technology advanced. Investigators were able to revisit old evidence, and eventually, that evidence produced a name. But there was another important piece. The DNA connection was not the only evidence linking Brasher's to the case. Investigators also re-examined ballistic evidence. A shell casing recovered from the Austin crime scene was connected to a firearm associated with another violent crime in Kentucky. That same weapon was linked to Brasher's. Now the case contained multiple forensic connections: DNA, ballistics, and a suspect whose history included other violent crimes. The picture was becoming clearer, but the investigation still had to proceed carefully, because the question was no longer simply, who might have done this? It was, can the evidence show exactly what happened? And there was another difficult reality. Brasher's had died in 1999. He could never be arrested. He could never stand trial. He could never answer questions. The families could never hear his explanation. That meant the investigators had to reconstruct the case without the person they believed was responsible. They had to rely on evidence, the biological evidence, the ballistic evidence, the original crime scene, the old reports, and everything investigators had learned over the years. The investigation had effectively become a conversation between the past and the present. The original investigators had one set of tools. Modern investigators had another. And the evidence that had once seemed inconclusive was now telling a different story. For the families, the discovery was deeply emotional. They had spent decades hearing different theories. They had watched suspects be arrested. They had watched convictions happen. They had watched those convictions collapse. And now, finally, there was a forensic connection to another man. But even then, there was no simple ending. The families still wanted to know what happened that night. They wanted to know why the girls were targeted. They wanted to know whether Brasher's acted alone. They wanted to know whether anyone else knew. And they wanted to know whether the full truth would ever be established. Police have said they believe Brasher's was the likely sole perpetrator, while the investigation remains open. That means there is still a difference between what investigators believe and what can be proven in a courtroom. Because Brasher's is dead, there will never be a traditional criminal trial against him. There will be no jury, no defense attorney questioning the evidence, no prosecution presenting the entire case, and no sentence. Instead, the historical record will have to rely on the forensic evidence and the investigation that follows. That is an unusual ending, but perhaps it is the only ending available. The case also became a warning about the danger of rushing toward a conclusion. The original investigation had produced confessions. Those confessions seemed to provide answers. But eventually the convictions collapsed. Modern DNA evidence pointed elsewhere. That does not mean every investigator involved in the original case acted with bad intentions. They were working under pressure. They were trying to solve an extremely difficult crime. But pressure can influence investigations. When a case becomes famous, there is an enormous desire for closure. And sometimes that desire can make investigators believe they are closer to the answer than they actually are. The yogurt shop murders demonstrate why physical evidence is so important. A statement can change. A memory can change. A confession can be challenged. But properly preserved biological evidence can remain useful for decades. The DNA from this case survived. And eventually it changed the story. For Jennifer's family. For Sarah's family. For Eliza's family. For Amy's family. And for the men who had spent years accused of killing them. The case had entered a new era. The old suspects had been cleared. A new suspect had been identified, but the final mystery remained. What happened inside the yogurt shop that night? The answer would require investigators to reconstruct the final hours again. Not through assumptions, not through confessions, but through evidence. And perhaps, after more than 30 years, the pieces were finally beginning to fit. The girls had gone to work. The shop had closed. Someone remained inside. The victims were attacked. They were bound. They were murdered. The building was burned. And somewhere in those final moments, the killer left behind something he could not erase. A microscopic biological trace. He may have believed the fire would destroy everything. He may have believed the crime would disappear into history. But the evidence survived. And more than 3 decades later, it helped investigators find his name. The fire had destroyed the building. But it had not destroyed the truth completely. The truth had been waiting, quietly, inside the evidence, and now investigators were finally able to hear it. For decades, the yogurt shop murders had remained trapped between 2 very different stories. One story belonged to the original investigation. 4 young girls had been murdered. Several young men had been accused. 2 had been convicted. And then those convictions collapsed. The other story was much newer. Modern forensic testing had identified Robert Eugene Brashers as a suspect connected to the crime. The difference between those 2 stories was enormous, and it forced investigators to look back at everything. The first question was obvious. How could the original investigation have gone so far in the wrong direction? The answer was not simple. In the years following the murders, investigators had been under tremendous pressure to solve the case. The victims were teenagers. The crime had shocked Austin. The families wanted justice, and the public wanted to know who had done it. When investigators eventually focused on Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott, the case appeared to be moving toward an answer. But the later DNA evidence told a different story. The biological evidence did not support those convictions, and eventually the men were released. That left investigators with an uncomfortable possibility. The real killer had been missed, and perhaps he had been missed for decades. Then in 2025, that possibility became much more concrete. Austin police announced that DNA testing had identified Brashers as a suspect. The announcement did not erase the past. It changed the way the past had to be understood. Investigators now had to examine the original evidence through a new lens. The old crime scene reports, the old witness statements, the old photographs, the old ballistics, and the old timeline. Every detail mattered again. One of the most important findings came from the fingernail clippings of Amy Ayers. Modern testing produced a DNA profile. That profile was compared with Brasher's DNA. The profiles matched. The Austin Police Department's forensic summary reported a statistical probability of approximately 1 in 2.5 million for a randomly selected unrelated person being the contributor. That was a powerful connection. It placed Brashers directly into the forensic story of the crime. But investigators still had to ask how his DNA came to be there. Was he inside the shop during the attack? Was there physical contact between him and Amy? Could the material have been transferred in another way? Those questions are important because DNA does not automatically tell investigators the entire story. It identifies a biological connection. The circumstances surrounding that connection must still be understood. Fortunately, the investigation did not rely on DNA alone. Ballistic evidence also became important. Investigators examined shell casings from the Austin crime scene. One of those casings was compared with evidence from another murder in Kentucky. The firearm connection provided another forensic link involving Brashers. Now the case had 2 different kinds of evidence pointing toward the same person. DNA and ballistics. That was very different from the evidence that had produced the earlier convictions. The original case had relied heavily on statements and confessions. The new investigation was being built around physical evidence. And physical evidence had one major advantage. It did not forget. A witness might forget what they saw. A suspect might change a story. A memory might become less reliable with time. But a biological sample preserved correctly could remain useful decades later. That was exactly what had happened. The evidence from 1991 had waited, and modern science had finally been able to use it. But there was another remarkable part of the story. Brashers had already been dead for years. He died in 1999 during a standoff with police. That meant investigators had discovered the identity of a possible killer more than 25 years after his death. He could not be arrested. He could not be questioned. And he could not stand trial. The families would never hear him explain what happened. That was perhaps the most frustrating part of the breakthrough. After 34 years, there was finally a name. But there would never be a courtroom confrontation. There would never be a sentence. And there would never be a direct answer to the simplest question. Why? Why did 4 girls have to die? Why were they attacked? Why was the building burned? And why did the person responsible remain hidden for so long? Investigators could try to answer those questions through evidence, but they could never ask Brashers himself. That made the remaining evidence even more important. Investigators began examining Brashers' background. He had been living in Austin around the time of the murders. He was a teenager in 1991. Later investigations connected his DNA to other violent crimes in several states. Those connections did not automatically prove his guilt in Austin, but they gave investigators additional context. His history showed that he had been capable of serious violence, and investigators found similarities between the Austin murders and other crimes associated with him. Victims being restrained, sexual violence, fire being used at crime scenes. Those similarities were disturbing, but investigators still had to distinguish between a pattern and proof. A pattern can help investigators understand a suspect. It cannot replace evidence. In the yogurt shop case, however, there was already physical evidence. The DNA, the ballistics, and the history. Together, these details created a much stronger case than the one that had existed in the 1990s. But the investigation was still not complete. Police continued asking whether Brasher's had acted alone. According to investigators, the evidence currently points toward Brasher's as the likely sole perpetrator. Still, the investigation remains open. That means investigators have not simply closed the door. They are still interested in information that could explain the remaining unanswered questions. For the families, this new chapter brought complicated emotions. There was relief, there was sadness, there was anger, and there was the painful realization that the man now connected to the crime had been dead for decades. The families had spent so much time waiting. Some relatives had died before the breakthrough. They never got to hear the name, never got to see the new evidence, never got to know that modern science had finally pointed investigators toward someone else. That is the cruel nature of cold cases. Sometimes the answer arrives too late for the people who spent their lives waiting for it. But there was another group of people affected by the breakthrough. The men who had been wrongly accused. Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Forrest Wellborn, and Maurice Pierce. They had spent years under suspicion. Springsteen and Scott had been convicted. Their convictions were eventually overturned. The charges were later dropped. Wellborn and Pierce were also cleared of the charges against them. And in 2025, a judge formally declared the four men innocent. That was an important moment, because solving one part of a cold case does not erase the damage caused by an earlier investigation. The men had lost years. Their families had suffered. Their reputations had been damaged. And the original accusations had followed them for decades. The case therefore became a story about two kinds of victims: the four girls who were murdered, and the people who were wrongly accused afterward. The victims' families wanted justice. The wrongly accused men wanted their names cleared. And the new forensic evidence finally moved both groups closer to an answer. In 2026, the city of Austin moved toward a $35 million settlement related to claims from the wrongly accused men and the estate of Maurice Pierce. It was an extraordinary development in a case that had already lasted more than 3 decades. But money could never undo what had happened. It could not return lost years. It could not bring back the 4 girls. And it could not erase the emotional damage caused by the original investigation. The settlement was about accountability. The murder investigation was about truth. And those were 2 different questions. The truth about the murders still needed to be understood. What happened during the final minutes at the yogurt shop? Why did the killer remain there long enough to bind and assault the victims? Why did he shoot them? Why did he start the fire? And what did he do afterward? Those questions were now being examined with the knowledge that investigators had a likely suspect. But there was still no complete narrative. The evidence could tell investigators where to look. It could identify a person. It could connect a weapon. But it could not necessarily recreate every moment of the crime. That would require investigators to combine everything: the forensic evidence, the timeline, the witnesses, the suspect's history, and the physical scene. Perhaps somewhere within those pieces was the complete answer. And perhaps that answer had been missed simply because investigators had been looking in the wrong direction. For 34 years, the case had been associated with 4 young men who were accused. Now, investigators were saying the evidence pointed toward someone else. That changed the meaning of every old clue. A suspicious detail that once seemed to point toward Springsteen or Scott could now be reconsidered. A witness statement could be read differently. A timeline could be rebuilt. And old evidence could be compared with the new suspect's known history. This is one of the most fascinating parts of cold case investigations. The evidence stays the same, but the questions change. In 1991, investigators asked, which local suspect committed this crime? Decades later, they could ask, Does the physical evidence identify someone who was never considered? That second question produced a very different result, and the answer was Robert Eugene Brasher's. But the case still had one final obstacle. The man was gone. There would be no confession, no explanation, no chance to ask him about the fire. The families would have to build their understanding from evidence alone. And that meant returning once again to the night of December 6, 1991. For girls, one yogurt shop, a closing time, a fire, and a killer who believed he could disappear. For decades, it looked as though he had succeeded. But he had left something behind, something microscopic, something he could not see, something investigators in 1991 could not fully use, and something that waited patiently for science to catch up. DNA. That tiny piece of evidence had survived everything: the fire, the investigation, the trials, the overturned convictions, the passing of years, and even the death of the man connected to it. Now it had finally spoken, and what it said changed the case forever. More than 30 years after the murders, investigators were finally looking at the same night with a completely different understanding. The names had changed, the technology had changed, and the evidence had changed the direction of the investigation. But one thing had not changed. For girls had entered a yogurt shop on a Friday night in December 1991. They never came home. Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, Amy Ayers. To understand what may have happened, investigators had to go back to the beginning. The final evening, the customers, the closing routine, and the moments before the fire. The yogurt shop was an ordinary business. Customers came in for dessert. Employees worked behind the counter. The atmosphere was casual. Nothing suggested that the building would soon become the scene of one of Austin's most notorious crimes. Jennifer and Sarah were sisters. They knew the shop. They knew the routine. Eliza and Amy were also familiar with the work environment. It was the kind of job teenagers could have while attending school. A normal Friday evening. A normal shift. A normal expectation that everyone would eventually go home. But sometime after the final customers had left, the situation changed. The girls were overpowered. They were bound. They were assaulted. And they were shot. Then the building was set on fire. The fire was not an accident. Someone deliberately started it after the murders. That fact made the crime especially disturbing. The killer did not simply leave the scene. He tried to erase it. The flames destroyed evidence. Smoke filled the building, and whatever had happened inside became much harder to reconstruct. But the killer made one mistake. He left evidence behind. DNA. That evidence would eventually lead investigators toward Brasher's. But the DNA alone could not explain everything. Investigators had to ask how Brasher's got inside the building. Did he enter as a customer? Did he wait until the shop was nearly empty? Did he know the girls? Or did he simply choose the location because it was vulnerable? There is no publicly confirmed answer to those questions, and that uncertainty is important. The modern investigation has identified a likely perpetrator, but it has not produced a complete minute-by-minute reconstruction of the crime. That is one of the limitations of a case that has been cold for so long. Evidence can identify a person without telling investigators exactly what that person was thinking. The families wanted those details. They wanted to understand the final moments. But the person who could have provided those answers was gone. So investigators had to look at the physical evidence. One of the strongest pieces was the DNA associated with Amy Ayers. The biological evidence connected Brasher's to the crime. The statistical significance was extremely strong. But investigators also examined ballistic evidence. A shell casing from the Austin crime scene was connected to a firearm that had been used in another murder in Kentucky. That firearm was associated with Brasher's. Now the investigation had two independent forensic paths pointing toward the same person: DNA and ballistics. This was dramatically different from the earlier prosecution. The earlier case had been built around people. The newer investigation was built around evidence. That difference could not be ignored. The original suspects had given statements and confessions, but their convictions did not survive. The modern forensic evidence pointed elsewhere, and suddenly, the case that had seemed to have an answer in the 1990s had become a completely different mystery. The real question was no longer simply who had been convicted. It was who had actually been there. And the DNA suggested that Brasher's had been. But could investigators place him in Austin at the exact time? Yes, historical records showed that he was living in Austin during the relevant period. That was important. The DNA was not pointing toward a random person who had never been near Texas. It was pointing toward a man who had been in the city when the murders occurred. Again, this did not automatically explain every detail, but it strengthened the connection. Then investigators examined his later history. Brasher's became connected through DNA to other violent crimes. His profile was associated with cases in multiple states. That gave investigators more context. But the Austin murders still required their own evidence. And they had it. The evidence from the yogurt shop, the DNA, the firearm connection, and the historical connection to Austin. The picture was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. But there was still one thing investigators could never recover: the victim's final thoughts. We can reconstruct movements. We can reconstruct evidence. We can examine timelines. But we cannot know exactly what Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy were thinking during those final minutes. Perhaps they believed the situation would end quickly. Perhaps they hoped someone would come through the door. Perhaps they realized they were in serious danger. Perhaps they tried to protect one another. We do not know. And that uncertainty is one of the most painful aspects of the case. The girls were teenagers. They had their entire lives ahead of them. They had families, plans, dreams, ordinary worries that suddenly became meaningless. A school assignment, a weekend plan, a conversation with a friend, a family dinner. All of those ordinary things were replaced by a tragedy. The crime also changed the lives of their families forever. Parents who expected daughters home that evening instead received devastating news. Siblings lost sisters. Friends lost friends. And the community lost its sense of safety. A place that had been ordinary became frightening. People began wondering whether a similar thing could happen to them. Could someone enter a small business at closing time? Could a teenager working alone become a target? Could a killer disappear without anyone noticing? Those fears were understandable. The murders had demonstrated how quickly an ordinary evening could become something horrific. But the investigation continued. Detectives had to move beyond fear. They had to work with evidence. And eventually, the evidence led them toward Brasher's. The discovery also helped explain why the original case had been so difficult. The person responsible had not been identified through the early investigation. Instead, the case became focused on other suspects. Those men were questioned. They confessed. They were convicted. And years later, they were cleared. The real forensic evidence had been waiting. This is why the case is often discussed as an example of the dangers of relying too heavily on confessions. A confession can feel like certainty, but certainty must come from evidence. If a confession contradicts physical evidence, investigators have to ask why. Was the confession accurate? Was it coerced? Was it contaminated by information investigators already knew? Or was the person actually guilty? Those questions became extremely important in the yogurt shop case. The later DNA evidence provided an answer that the original investigation had not been able to produce. It pointed toward someone else. That did not mean the original investigators had no evidence. They had evidence, but they interpreted it within a particular theory. Once that theory collapsed, the entire case had to be rebuilt. The new investigation was therefore not simply searching for a killer. It was correcting a history that had already affected innocent people, a history that had left 4 families waiting, and a history that had allowed the true suspect to remain unidentified for decades. Then came another remarkable fact. Brasher's had died before the DNA breakthrough. He died in 1999. That means the families had spent years waiting for an answer, while the man now linked to the case was already gone. He lived through the 1990s. He lived while the original suspects were being prosecuted. He lived while the families waited. Then he died, and only decades later did science connect him to the crime. That raises a haunting possibility. If modern DNA technology had existed in exactly the same form in 1991, the case might have been very different. The original suspects might never have been arrested. Investigators might have focused on Brasher's much earlier. The families might have received answers sooner. The wrongfully accused men might never have lost years of their lives. But history cannot be rewritten. The technology available in 1991 was limited. Investigators could only work with what they had, and the evidence that might have changed everything remained unresolved, until science caught up. Now the case has a different shape. The 4 victims are known. The original suspects have been cleared. A likely perpetrator has been identified. The forensic evidence is stronger than it has ever been. But there is still one major question. What was the motive? Why would Brasher's target the yogurt shop? Why these 4 girls? Was the crime planned? Was it spontaneous? Was robbery involved? Was sexual violence the primary motive? Was the fire planned from the beginning? Or did the killer start the fire only after the murders? Without Brasher's alive to explain himself, those questions may never receive definitive answers. And perhaps that is the hardest part of the modern breakthrough. The families finally know more, but they still do not know everything. The DNA can tell them who may have been involved. It cannot tell them why. The ballistics can connect a weapon. It cannot tell them what the killer was thinking. The old evidence can reconstruct pieces of the timeline. It cannot restore the final conversations between the girls and their families. That is something no technology can bring back. Still, there is a kind of justice in finally identifying a person connected to the crime. For decades, the killer had been unknown. Now there is a name, and that name has a history investigators can examine. A history that may reveal more about the person who entered the yogurt shop that night. Perhaps there are still people alive who knew him. Perhaps someone remembers where he was. Perhaps someone remembers a conversation. Perhaps someone saw something, but did not realize its significance. This is why investigators have continued asking for information. Because a DNA breakthrough can open a door, but sometimes witnesses are needed to walk through it. The investigation is not simply about proving what the DNA already suggests. It is about understanding the complete story. And that story still has missing pieces. What happened immediately before the attack? How did the killer control 4 people? How long did he remain inside? How did he leave? Where did he go? What did he do with the weapon? And what did he do afterward? Those questions may never be answered completely, but investigators now have a much better starting point. Instead of beginning with an unknown person, they can begin with Brasher's. They can examine his life, his movements, his connections, his criminal history, and his relationship to the evidence. That is a much stronger position than investigators had in 1991. The case has therefore entered a new stage. It is no longer simply a mystery. It is a historical reconstruction based on modern forensic evidence. And perhaps one day, another piece will appear. A witness, a document, a photograph, a forgotten connection. Something that explains what happened after the murders. Until then, the evidence tells us only part of the story. 4 girls went to work. A killer entered their world. The shop burned, and the truth remained hidden. For decades, then science found a trace. And that trace led investigators to a man whose name had never been at the center of the original case. The fire had destroyed the building, but it could not destroy everything. Somewhere in the surviving evidence was the smallest piece of the truth. And that piece had been waiting for more than 30 years. For more than 30 years, the yogurt shop murders remained one of Austin's most painful mysteries. 4 girls had been murdered. 2 men had been convicted and later cleared. Other men had been accused. The families had waited, and the real killer remained unidentified. Then, in 2025, everything changed. Austin police announced that advanced DNA testing had identified Robert Eugene Brasher's as the suspect connected to the murders. Police emphasized that the investigation remained open and ongoing. For the families, hearing that name after 34 years must have been an extraordinary moment. A name they had never heard before. A name that had not appeared at the center of the original prosecution. A name belonging to a man who had already been dead for more than 2 decades. Robert Eugene Brasher's had died in 1999 during a police standoff. That meant the breakthrough had arrived too late for a trial. There would be no courtroom, no jury, no sentence, and no chance to ask him directly what happened. But there was something else. There was evidence. Modern forensic testing had connected Brasher's to biological material recovered from the crime scene. According to Austin police, DNA from Amy Ayer's fingernail clippings produced a profile that matched Brasher's. with the reported statistical probability of a randomly selected unrelated person being the contributor at approximately 1 in 2.5 million. Investigators also re-examined ballistic evidence. A shell casing recovered from the Austin crime scene was connected to a firearm associated with another murder in Kentucky. That weapon was linked to Brasher's. The evidence was now pointing in the same direction. DNA, ballistics, a man who had been living in Austin around the time of the murders, and a history of violent crimes in other states. For investigators, the case had changed dramatically. But for the families, the breakthrough brought complicated emotions. For years, they had been told that the case had already been solved. They had been told that Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott were responsible. Those men had been convicted. Then the convictions were overturned. The charges were eventually dropped. And in 2025, a Texas judge formally declared Springsteen, Scott, Forrest Wellborn, and Maurice Pierce innocent of the murders. The families therefore had to experience something unusual. They had to watch the story change more than once. First, they had no suspect. Then they had suspects. Then they had convictions. Then those convictions disappeared. And finally, decades later, forensic science pointed toward another man. It was not the ending anyone could have imagined in 1991, but it was an important one, because the 4 girls deserved to have their names separated from the uncertainty that had surrounded the case for so long. Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, Amy Ayers. They were not responsible for what happened. They had simply gone to work. They were teenagers. They expected an ordinary evening. Instead, they became victims of a crime that would remain unsolved for more than 3 decades. The new evidence could not change what happened to them, but it could change how their story was understood, and it could finally give their families a clearer answer. Still, one question remained. Why? Why did Brasher's go to the yogurt shop? Why did he attack the girls? Why did he bind them? Why did he assault them? Why did he shoot them? And why did he set the building on fire? There may never be complete answers. The person who might have provided them died in 1999. Investigators can reconstruct evidence. They can examine patterns. They can compare crimes. But they cannot recover a conversation that never happened. They cannot ask a dead man what he was thinking. That is perhaps the cruelest part of the breakthrough. The families finally have a name, but they may never have the complete story. Still, investigators have learned more about Brasher's through other cases. His DNA had been connected to violent crimes in several states. Authorities found similarities between those crimes and the Austin murders. The victims in some of those cases had been restrained. Sexual violence was involved, and fires were used at some crime scenes. These similarities gave investigators additional context, but they also had to remain careful. A pattern can strengthen an investigation. It cannot replace direct evidence. In the Austin case, however, the direct forensic evidence was already significant. The DNA, the ballistics, and Brasher's presence in Austin during the relevant period. Police ultimately said they believed Brasher's was the likely sole perpetrator while continuing the investigation. That meant another mystery was beginning to fade. For years, people had wondered whether there had been several killers, whether the 4 originally accused men were involved, whether there was an organized group, whether the murders were connected to something larger. The modern investigation pointed toward a much simpler possibility. One man, one terrible night, for victims, and a crime scene that he tried to destroy. But even if that explanation is correct, it does not make the story simple, because the consequences spread far beyond that one night. The 4 girls lost their lives. Their families lost daughters and sisters. The wrongly accused men lost years. The Austin community lost its sense of safety, and investigators carried the weight of a case that refused to disappear. The 2026 settlement involving the wrongly accused men added another chapter. The city of Austin agreed to a settlement totaling up to $35 million related to claims arising from the wrongful arrests and convictions. But no amount of money could return the years that had been lost. It could not restore the girls' lives. It could not give their families the decades they spent waiting, and it could not erase the pain caused by the original investigation. The settlement was about accountability. The DNA breakthrough was about the murder investigation, and the families still needed something else. Closure. Closure does not always mean knowing every detail. Sometimes it means finally knowing that the person originally accused was not responsible. Sometimes it means knowing that the real suspect has been identified. Sometimes it means simply having enough evidence to stop wondering whether the truth was completely lost. For the families of the yogurt shop victims, the 2025 breakthrough may have provided part of that closure. But the investigation remains important because there are still questions. Police continue to seek information. They want to know whether anyone remembers Brasher's in Austin around the time of the murders. They want to know about his movements. They want to know whether anyone had contact with him. And they want to determine whether anything else can explain the crime. Because even after a major forensic breakthrough, investigators should not stop asking questions. A cold case can contain more than one truth. The identity of a suspect is one truth. The exact circumstances are another. The motive is another. And the full timeline is another. The yogurt shop case has finally moved much closer to those answers. But it may never provide all of them. The passage of time has made that impossible in some respects. Witnesses have died. Memories have faded. Documents may be incomplete. And the person investigators believe was responsible is gone. Still, one thing has changed forever. The killer is no longer completely unknown. For 34 years, the families had no name. Now they have one. Robert Eugene Brasher's. And behind that name is a trail of forensic evidence that did not exist in usable form when the murders happened. That is perhaps the most remarkable part of the entire story. The killer may have believed the fire would destroy the evidence. The building burned. The crime scene was damaged. The years passed, but a tiny biological trace survived. It survived the flames. It survived the investigation. It survived the trials. It survived the overturned convictions. It survived the death of the suspect. And eventually science found it. The evidence waited longer than anyone expected. But it waited. And when technology finally caught up, it pointed investigators toward a man who had been hiding in plain sight in the history of the case. Not because someone suddenly remembered his face. Not because someone finally confessed. But because the evidence itself had remained. That is why cold case investigations can sometimes take decades. The truth does not always disappear. Sometimes it becomes buried beneath time. And sometimes all it takes is one new method to uncover it. For the 4 girls, however, there is one thing that can never be changed. They should have grown older. Jennifer should have turned 18. Sarah should have grown beyond 15. Eliza should have continued into adulthood. Amy should have experienced the years that were taken from her at only 13. They should have had ordinary lives. Graduations. Jobs, friendships, families, birthdays, Christmases. All of those possibilities ended on one December night. The people who loved them were left behind. And for more than 30 years, they had to live with unanswered questions. Now, at least, one of those questions has an answer. The man connected to the crime has been identified. The men who were wrongly accused have been formally cleared. And the investigation has entered a new chapter. But the final chapter is not necessarily about the killer. It is about the girls. Because after all the theories, all the suspects, all the court cases, all the DNA testing, and all the years of investigation, the most important names remain the same. Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, Amy, for young lives, for families, for stories that ended far too soon. The case may eventually fade from headlines. The investigation may eventually close. The evidence may eventually be placed back into storage, but their names should not disappear. They were more than victims in a famous cold case. They were people, and that is how they should be remembered, not only for the terrible way they died, but for the lives they lived before that night, for their families, for their friends, for the people who knew them, and for the ordinary moments that existed before everything changed. The yogurt shop murders began as an ordinary Friday night. They became a nightmare. Then a mystery, then a wrongful conviction case, and finally, decades later, a forensic breakthrough. But even after all of that, one question remains. Can a case ever truly be finished when the person who may have known the complete truth is no longer alive? Perhaps not, but sometimes justice does not arrive in the form we expect. Sometimes it arrives as a DNA profile, a shell casing, an old evidence box, a name discovered decades too late. And sometimes that is enough to finally say, we know more now than we did before. The families waited, the evidence waited, and eventually the truth began to emerge. The fire could destroy a building. It could destroy memories of a crime scene. It could destroy physical evidence. But it could not destroy everything. Somewhere in the ashes, something remained. And more than 30 years later, that something finally spoke. The discovery of Robert Eugene Brasher's changed the direction of the case. But it did not erase the questions. After more than 3 decades, investigators finally had a suspect whose DNA was connected to evidence from the crime scene. Yet the man who might have been able to explain everything was already dead. That meant investigators had to reconstruct the truth without him. They had to rely on evidence, and that evidence led them back to the same place where the mystery had begun. The yogurt shop. December 6, 1991. A Friday night. For girls working an ordinary shift. And a few hours later, a building consumed by fire. The Austin Police Department announced in September 2025 that its investigators had identified Brasher's through extensive DNA testing, while emphasizing that the case remained open and ongoing. That statement was important. Police had not simply announced that every question was solved. They had announced a major breakthrough. There was still work to do, and perhaps the biggest remaining question concerned the final hours of the victims. Who saw them last? Who was inside the shop? And what happened between the final customers leaving and the fire being discovered? Those questions had been examined before, but now investigators could look at them with new information. One of the most interesting details from the old investigation involved the final customers. According to an Austin police document reviewing the case, 2 customers reported seeing 2 unusual men sitting inside the shop shortly before closing. At the time, that detail seemed potentially important. 2 strangers sitting quietly in a nearly empty yogurt shop, waiting, watching, or perhaps simply eating yogurt. There was no way to know what they were thinking, and eyewitness memories can be unreliable. A person might remember seeing someone, but remembering that person accurately decades later is extremely difficult. That is why investigators could not simply assume that those 2 men were the killers. Still, the detail remained part of the historical record. It raised a possibility. Perhaps the killers had been inside the shop before the attack. Perhaps they had watched the employees. Perhaps they were waiting for the right moment. Or perhaps they were completely innocent customers. The evidence could not establish which explanation was correct. That uncertainty became even more important after the original convictions collapsed. Because once the first theory failed, investigators had to reconsider everything. The old timeline, the witnesses, the suspects, and the physical evidence. The DNA gave them a new direction, but it did not necessarily tell them where Brasher's had been sitting. It did not tell them what he said. It did not tell them when he entered, and it did not tell them how the attack began. Those details might never be recovered, but investigators could still examine what remained. The DNA was one piece. The ballistic evidence was another. And then there was the fire. The fire had been an enormous obstacle from the beginning. A crime scene can preserve information. A fire can destroy it. Heat can damage materials. Smoke can contaminate surfaces. Structures can collapse. Objects can be moved. And evidence can disappear. The person responsible may have understood that. If the fire was deliberately started after the murders, destroying evidence may have been one of its purposes. But the fire did not destroy everything. Some biological evidence survived. Some ballistic evidence survived. And enough information survived for investigators, decades later, to build a new theory. That is remarkable. The killer may have believed the fire would erase the crime. Instead, the smallest surviving traces became the most important clues. The DNA from Amy Ayer's fingernail clippings became especially significant. Modern testing produced a usable STR profile. That profile was directly compared with Brasher's profile. It matched. The Austin Police Department reported the statistical significance as approximately 1 in 2.5 million for a randomly selected unrelated person being the contributor. That did not tell investigators everything, but it told them something extremely important. Brasher's was not merely a name discovered through a theory. His biological profile was connected to the evidence, and that changed the case. Still, The families had waited too long for investigators to make another mistake. They needed more than a dramatic announcement. They needed the evidence to be carefully examined. That is why the investigators continued looking at other forensic evidence. Ballistics provided another important connection. A shell casing from the Austin crime scene was examined alongside evidence from another murder. The comparison helped connect the firearm to Brasher's. According to reporting on the Breakthrough, investigators linked the same weapon to a 1998 Kentucky murder. Now the case contained another layer. DNA connected Brasher's to biological evidence. Ballistics connected a firearm associated with him to evidence related to the crime, and his history showed that he had been involved in other violent crimes. The pieces were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, but investigators still had to distinguish between evidence and assumption. A suspect can have a violent history. That does not automatically mean he committed every violent crime connected to his name. A weapon can be connected to a person. That does not automatically explain every detail of a separate crime, and DNA can place a person in a biological chain. It still has to be interpreted in context. The investigators therefore had to combine everything. That is what makes cold case work so difficult. One clue rarely solves the entire case. Instead, investigators look for several independent pieces that point in the same direction. In this case, those pieces began to align. The DNA, the ballistics, the historical timeline, and Brasher's presence in Austin around the relevant period. The result was a much stronger picture than investigators had possessed decades earlier. But the question of motive remained. Why would Brasher's attack 4 girls? There is no definitive public answer. Perhaps the crime was sexually motivated. Perhaps the girls were targeted because they were vulnerable employees closing a business. Perhaps the attacker intended robbery, and the situation escalated. Perhaps the attack had been planned from the beginning. Or perhaps the reason was something investigators have not yet discovered. Without Brasher's alive, motive may remain one of the hardest questions to answer. And motive is not always necessary to establish responsibility. A person can be identified through evidence, even when investigators never understand why they acted. But for the families, knowing who was responsible would not necessarily be enough. They wanted to understand. They wanted to know what their daughters experienced. They wanted to know why the night happened the way it did. And they wanted to know whether the killer acted alone. That final question remains especially important. Austin police have indicated that investigators believe Brasher's was the likely sole perpetrator, but the investigation remains ongoing. If that conclusion is correct, then one man controlled the entire situation. He entered the shop. He overpowered 4 people. He restrained them. He assaulted them. He murdered them. And he started the fire. That is difficult to imagine, but the physical evidence does not tell us exactly how it happened. There may have been moments that will never be known. There may have been conversations that disappeared forever. There may have been details that only the victims and killer knew. That is the tragedy of an investigation involving a dead suspect. The person who may have possessed the answers cannot be questioned. The investigators can only reconstruct. And reconstruction always contains limits. Still, there was another important development in the modern investigation. The men who had originally been accused were finally formally cleared. Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Forrest Wellborn, and Maurice Pierce. Springsteen and Scott had been convicted, while the charges against all 4 men were eventually dropped. In 2025, a Texas judge formally declared the 4 men innocent. For them and their families, that moment was decades in the making. But it also demonstrated something important. A criminal investigation can affect innocent people long after the original crime. The men had been teenagers when the murders occurred. Their names became associated with one of Austin's most notorious crimes. They lived with accusations. They went through years of legal battles, and some spent time in prison. Eventually, modern evidence helped separate them from the murders. The city later agreed to a proposed settlement totaling up to $35 million related to claims arising from their wrongful arrests and convictions. That settlement cannot restore lost years, but it represents another part of the case's history. The story is therefore not only about 4 murdered girls. It is also about how an investigation can go wrong, and how difficult it can be to correct that mistake decades later. The yogurt shop murders demonstrate why investigators must remain open to new evidence. Even after a conviction, even after a confession, even after years of believing one theory, evidence can change the story. In this case, DNA changed it dramatically. The original investigators believed they had found the killers. Modern investigators eventually identified someone else. And the difference came from evidence that had been preserved. That is perhaps the most important lesson of the entire case. Time does not always destroy the truth. Sometimes it hides it. Sometimes the truth remains in a box. A laboratory sample, a shell casing, a photograph, a forgotten report, waiting for technology to catch up. For more than 30 years, the evidence from the yogurt shop waited. Then science gave investigators a new way to read it. And suddenly, a man who had been dead for decades became central to the investigation. But there was still one final mystery. What happened immediately after the fire? Where did the killer go? Did anyone see him? Did he tell anyone what he had done? Did he leave Austin? Did he keep the weapon? Did he live with the knowledge of what he had done? Those questions may never be answered, unless someone who knew something comes forward. That is why investigators continue asking for information. A person who was a teenager in 1991 is now middle-aged or older. Someone who knew Brasher's might still remember something. Someone who saw him around Austin might still have an old memory. And sometimes, after decades, a person finally decides to speak. The case is therefore not completely silent. There is still an opportunity for another piece of evidence to appear. Another witness, another record, another connection, another answer. But even if no new evidence ever appears, the case has already changed. The original suspects have been cleared. A new suspect has been identified, and modern forensic science has provided a path toward understanding what happened. The 4 girls are no longer simply victims of an unsolved crime. Their case has finally moved closer to an explanation. Not a perfect explanation, not one that answers every question, but one supported by evidence. And that distinction matters, because after decades of uncertainty, the families deserve more than theories. They deserve facts. They deserve honesty about what is known, and they deserve honesty about what remains unknown. The evidence points toward Brasher's. The investigation continues, and the final details may never be recovered. But the story of Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy is not defined only by what happened to them. They had lives before that night. They had people who loved them, and they had futures that should have continued. The investigation may eventually close. The evidence may eventually be archived. The headlines may eventually disappear. But their names should remain, because at the center of every cold case is a person. And in this case, there were 4. 4 young girls who went to work one Friday night. For families who expected them home. For lives that ended before they had the chance to become what they might have been. The mystery lasted more than 30 years. The evidence waited. And finally, the answer began to emerge. But perhaps the most haunting thought is this. The killer may have believed that the fire would erase everything. He was wrong. The building burned. The years passed. The witnesses aged. The original suspects were wrongly accused, and the man investigators now believe was responsible eventually died. But the evidence survived. A tiny trace. A microscopic connection. Something that could not speak in 1991. Something that waited until science was ready. And when investigators finally listened, it gave them a name. Robert Eugene Brasher's. The case had finally found the person at the center of the evidence. But the story was still not completely over, because there was one final question left. After everything that had happened, after the murders, the fire, the wrongful convictions, the DNA breakthrough, and the identification of Brasher's, what would justice actually mean for the families? That question would become the final part of the story. For more than 3 decades, the families of Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, and Amy Ayers lived with a question that seemed impossible to answer. Who killed them? For years, the answer appeared to be one thing. Then it became another. And eventually, modern forensic science pointed investigators toward a man who had already been dead for decades. But even after the discovery of Robert Eugene Brasher's, the families were left with another question. What does justice look like when the person responsible can never stand trial? There would be no courtroom, no jury, no sentence, No moment when a judge could look at the accused and announce the punishment. Brasher's died in 1999. The breakthrough came more than 25 years later. That meant justice could not take the form that most people imagine when they think about a murder investigation. Instead, it had to come through something else. The truth. The truth about the evidence. The truth about the original investigation. And the truth about the people who had been wrongly accused. For the first time, the families could separate the victims from the men who had previously been convicted. Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott were no longer the people the public should associate with the murders. The evidence had changed the story, and the courts eventually formally declared Springsteen, Scott, Forrest Wellborn, and Maurice Pierce innocent. That mattered, because for years their names had been attached to the crime. Now there was a legal acknowledgement that they had been wrongfully accused. But there was another painful reality. The original investigation had consumed years. Years that could never be returned. Years in which the real perpetrator remained unidentified. And years in which the victims' families continued waiting. That is why the yogurt shop case is more than a story about a cold murder. It is a story about time. Time can help solve a case. But time can also create damage. Witnesses disappear. Memories fade. People move. Evidence can be lost. And families grow older while waiting for answers. In this case, technology eventually helped recover part of the truth. The DNA evidence connected Brasher's to the crime. The ballistic evidence provided another connection, and investigators examined his history. But the passage of time meant that many questions would probably never be answered. Why did he choose that shop? Why did he attack those girls? Why did he burn the building? Was there a plan? Was there a motive? Did he tell anyone? Those questions may remain mysteries forever. And perhaps that is something every family of a cold case victim has to face. Sometimes the truth arrives incomplete. Sometimes the person who knows everything dies before investigators find him. Sometimes science can tell you who but not why. But even an incomplete answer can be meaningful. For decades, the killer had been a shadow. Now investigators had a name. That alone changed the emotional landscape of the case. The families no longer had to wonder whether the person responsible would ever be identified. They had a forensic connection. And they had a clearer understanding of what happened to the men who had been wrongly accused. The case had finally moved closer to reality, but there was still another group of people who deserved attention. The investigators, the detectives, the forensic scientists, the people who kept the evidence, the people who continued working on the case after the original investigation had ended. Cold cases rarely have one person who solves everything. They are usually solved through layers of work. One detective notices something. Another preserves evidence. A forensic scientist develops a new technique. A laboratory processes an old sample. A database produces a possible connection. A genealogical search narrows a family line. And eventually, all of those pieces come together. The yogurt shop case followed that pattern. The evidence had been preserved. DNA technology improved. Investigators revisited the old material. And eventually, the unknown profile was connected to Brasher's. It was not a single moment of magic. It was decades of accumulated work. And that is important to remember, because cold cases often look simple after they are solved. People see the headline. DNA identifies suspect after 34 years. But behind that headline are years of uncertainty, years of testing, years of waiting, and countless hours spent examining evidence that may have seemed useless at the time. One small sample can become important only after technology changes. That is what happened here. The evidence was waiting. The families were waiting. And eventually science caught up. But the most important people in this story remain the four girls. Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, Amy. Their names deserve to be remembered beyond the circumstances of their deaths. Jennifer was 17. Sarah was 15. Eliza was 17. Amy was only 13. They were not statistics. They were young people with families and friends. They had ordinary lives. And the fact that their case became famous should never erase the fact that they were individuals. The investigation may be remembered because of the DNA breakthrough. The wrongful convictions may be remembered because of the legal history. But their families remember something much more personal. They remember daughters, sisters, friends, people who should still be alive. That is the part no investigation can repair. No DNA test can restore a life. No court ruling can undo a murder. No settlement can bring back the years that were lost. Justice can identify responsibility. It can correct the historical record. It can clear innocent people. But it cannot reverse time. That is why the 2025 breakthrough was both hopeful and heartbreaking. It gave the families something they had been waiting for. But it arrived too late. The man connected to the evidence was already dead. There would never be a trial, and there would never be a chance for the families to look at him and demand answers. Still, there is another form of justice. Being believed, being remembered, having the truth officially recognized, and perhaps most importantly, having the innocent separated from the guilty. The 4 men who were wrongly accused spent years carrying a burden that was not theirs. Their names were connected to the murders. Their families suffered. Their lives changed. Now, the legal record tells a different story, and that correction matters. It does not erase what happened, but it prevents future generations from repeating the same mistake. The yogurt shop murders also demonstrate why investigators must remain willing to reconsider old cases. A case is not necessarily solved simply because someone has been convicted. A conviction can be wrong. A confession can be false. A witness can be mistaken. And evidence can later reveal something completely different. That is why the modern investigation looked again at the physical evidence. The DNA did not care about the original theory. It did not care about the original suspects. It simply pointed toward the biological profile. And eventually, that profile pointed toward Brasher's. The evidence had its own story. Investigators simply needed the tools to understand it. Today, the case stands in a strange place. It is no longer completely unsolved. But it is not completely explained either. A likely perpetrator has been identified. The original suspects have been cleared. The forensic evidence is stronger than ever. But the motive remains uncertain. The exact sequence of events remains partly uncertain. And some questions may never be answered. That may be the final reality of the case. Not every mystery receives a perfect ending. Sometimes the best investigators can do is bring the truth as close as the surviving evidence allows. And in this case, the evidence has brought them much closer. The families now know that the men once convicted were not the killers. They know that modern forensic evidence points toward Brasher's. They know that the investigation remains open. And they know that the case they have carried for decades is finally being viewed through a different lens. That is progress. Slow progress. Painful progress. But progress nonetheless. And perhaps one day, another piece of information will appear. Someone may remember something. Someone may find an old photograph. Someone may discover a forgotten document. Someone may finally decide to tell investigators what they knew. If that happens, the case could move even closer to a complete explanation. Until then, the evidence remains, quietly preserved, waiting, just as it did for decades. The story of the yogurt shop murders is therefore not only about the night 4 girls were killed. It is about what happened afterward. The investigation, the accusations, the trials, the wrongful convictions, the waiting, the science, and finally, the discovery of a name. A name that came too late for a trial, but perhaps not too late for the truth. The girls cannot speak. The original crime scene cannot speak. The suspect cannot speak. But the evidence can. And after 34 years, it finally began to tell its story. There are some names that become attached to a crime so strongly that it can be difficult to separate the person from the accusation. For years, 4 names had been connected to the yogurt shop murders. Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Forrest Wellborn, Maurice Pierce. But those names belonged to men who were accused, not the person investigators now believe was responsible. And that distinction became one of the most important parts of the case. The murders had happened in 1991. The investigation had continued. Suspects had been questioned. Confessions had been obtained. Trials had taken place. And eventually, the convictions against the men accused of the murders collapsed. Years later, modern DNA evidence would point investigators toward Robert Eugene Brasher's instead. In 2025, a Texas judge formally declared the 4 previously accused men innocent. For the men, it was an extraordinary moment. But it was also bittersweet. because being declared innocent decades later does not mean the years simply disappear. It does not erase the memories of being arrested. It does not erase the fear of facing a courtroom. It does not erase the time spent in prison. And it does not erase the suspicion that followed their names. The case had changed their lives, and it had changed the lives of their families. Imagine being young and suddenly becoming associated with one of the most horrifying crimes in your city. Imagine people hearing your name and immediately thinking about 4 murdered girls. Imagine knowing that your family has to defend you while the entire community is demanding justice. And then imagine spending years trying to prove that you were not responsible. That was the reality faced by the men who had been accused. The later DNA evidence changed the historical record, but it could not change what had already happened. Meanwhile, the 4 victims remained at the center of the story. Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, Amy. Their families had never stopped waiting for answers, and the new evidence finally gave them something they had not had before. A direction, a suspect, a forensic connection, but not a complete explanation. That distinction is important. A cold case can reach a breakthrough without reaching a perfect ending. Investigators can identify the person connected to the evidence. They can establish that previous suspects were wrongfully accused, but they may still not know every detail of the crime. That is where the yogurt shop case stands. The evidence points toward Brasher's, but Brasher's cannot be questioned. He died in 1999. He cannot tell investigators whether someone helped him. He cannot explain the fire. He cannot explain the motive. He cannot tell the families what happened during the final minutes of their daughters' lives. Those answers disappeared with him. Perhaps there are still people alive who know something. Perhaps someone saw Brasher's around the time of the murders. Perhaps someone remembers a conversation. Perhaps someone knows something about the weapon. Or perhaps the complete truth will remain hidden forever. Investigators have continued to keep the case open, and that means the possibility of another discovery remains. Cold cases sometimes move forward in unexpected ways. A person may finally decide to speak. A family member may discover an old letter. A forensic laboratory may develop a new testing method. A database may produce a new connection. Something that seemed meaningless decades earlier can suddenly become important. That is exactly what happened with the DNA evidence. In 1991, investigators could not use it in the way modern investigators eventually could. The technology developed, the evidence remained, and the case changed. This is why preserving evidence is so important. Sometimes investigators do not know how valuable a piece of evidence will become. A tiny biological sample may seem limited. A shell casing may seem like only one object. A photograph may seem like an ordinary crime scene record. But decades later, those things can become the key to an entire investigation. The yogurt shop case demonstrates that perfectly. The fire destroyed much of the crime scene, but it could not destroy everything. Some evidence survived, and that evidence eventually pointed investigators toward Brasher's. The modern investigation also changed the way people understood the original case. For years, the public had heard about the men who had been convicted. Now the public had to understand that those convictions were wrong. That can be difficult. People naturally want a simple story. A crime happens. Police investigate. A suspect is arrested. A jury hears the evidence. A conviction follows. The story ends. But real life is rarely that simple. Sometimes the wrong person is arrested. Sometimes a confession is unreliable. Sometimes evidence is misunderstood. And sometimes the truth takes decades to emerge. The yogurt shop murders became an example of that painful reality. The original investigation produced an apparent answer. But the answer did not survive. The new evidence forced everyone to look again. And when they did, the story changed. That change also carried an important lesson. Justice is not simply about obtaining a conviction. Justice is about finding the truth. Sometimes those two things are the same. Sometimes they are not. In this case, the original convictions were not the truth. The later forensic evidence showed investigators that they had to look elsewhere. That process took decades, but eventually the truth moved closer. And perhaps that is what justice means in a case where the suspect is already dead. It means making sure the historical record is correct. It means clearing innocent people. It means identifying the person connected to the physical evidence. and it means remembering the victims. The 4 girls should not be remembered only because their deaths became a famous mystery. They should be remembered as young people. Jennifer was 17. Sarah was 15. Eliza was 17. Amy was 13. They had families. They had friends. They had plans. Their lives were not supposed to end at a yogurt shop. The tragedy is not simply that they were murdered. It is that so much of their future was taken away. Birthdays they never celebrated. Places they never visited. People they never met. Dreams they never had the chance to pursue. The investigation can never restore those things, but remembering them can prevent their lives from becoming lost beneath the mystery. That is why their names matter. Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, Amy Ayers. 4 names, 4 lives, and 4 families forever connected by one terrible night. The case also reminds us how much time can change. In 1991, the girls were teenagers. Today, people who were their age then are older adults. The world itself has changed. Technology has changed. Forensic science has changed. The way investigators solve crimes has changed. But the evidence from that night remained. And eventually, modern science reached back across all those years. The DNA did not know that 30 years had passed. It did not know about the trials. It did not know about the wrongful convictions. It did not know that Brasher's had died. It simply contained information. And when investigators finally had the tools to read that information, the case moved forward. That is what makes the breakthrough so powerful. It was not based on someone suddenly remembering a face. It was not based on a rumor. It was not based on another confession. It came from evidence that had been preserved. And that evidence helped investigators identify a man who had escaped suspicion for decades. Still, the families may never receive every answer. They may never know exactly what happened during those final minutes. They may never know what the killer said. They may never know whether the girls understood what was happening. And they may never know why. Those are questions that can haunt families forever. But perhaps one of the most important answers has finally arrived. The men who were accused were not the people the evidence now points toward. The historical record has been corrected. The investigation has a new direction. And the 4 girls have finally been separated from the men who were once wrongly blamed for their deaths. There is another difficult part of the story. The person investigators now believe was responsible died before the truth was discovered. That means there is no possibility of punishment. No possibility of hearing a confession. No possibility of asking him to explain himself. For the families, that can feel incomplete. But perhaps the truth itself is a form of justice. Knowing that the wrong men were not responsible matters. Knowing that the evidence points toward another person matters. And knowing that the case was not forgotten matters. The investigation continued for decades because people kept looking. Detectives kept records. Forensic scientists preserved evidence. Families kept asking questions. And eventually, those efforts produced a breakthrough. That is something worth remembering. A cold case can seem impossible. But impossible does not always mean unsolvable. Sometimes the evidence simply needs time. Sometimes science needs to catch up. And sometimes the people working on a case need to be willing to admit that the original answer was wrong. The yogurt shop murders required all 3. The original theory had to be reconsidered. The old evidence had to be tested again. And modern science had to provide the tools. Only then did investigators reach the breakthrough. But even now, the story remains unfinished. There are still questions. There are still details that investigators may want to understand. And there is still the possibility that someone knows something that has never been revealed. That possibility remains important, because the man investigators believe was responsible is dead. If anyone else knows what happened, they may be the only living people who can provide information about the final hours. Perhaps one day someone will come forward. Perhaps not. But the investigation has already achieved something extraordinary. After more than 30 years, the unknown suspect finally has a name. And the men who were wrongly accused finally have something they should have had from the beginning. Their innocence recognized. The story has taken a long and painful path. From a quiet yogurt shop, to a burned building, to 4 murders, to arrests, to confessions, to convictions, to overturned convictions, to decades of uncertainty, and finally to DNA. a single thread connecting the past to the present. A piece of evidence that survived when almost everything else changed. And perhaps that is the final lesson of this case. Truth does not always arrive quickly. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it takes decades. But when evidence is preserved and people continue searching, the past can still speak. And on this case, after 34 years of silence, it finally did. The story of the yogurt shop murders had begun with an ordinary Friday evening. For girls went to work. A few hours later, the shop was burning, and 4 families were beginning a nightmare that would last for decades. For a long time, investigators believed they had found the people responsible. But eventually that conclusion collapsed. The men who had been convicted were cleared. The case remained open, and the evidence waited. Then modern forensic science brought the investigation back to life. DNA connected Robert Eugene Brasher's to evidence from the crime scene. Ballistic evidence provided another connection, and investigators began examining his history. The case had finally reached a point where the evidence was pointing somewhere very different from where it had pointed decades earlier. But there was still something important missing: a complete explanation. Investigators could identify a likely perpetrator. They could establish forensic connections. But they could not ask Brasher's what happened. He was already dead. That meant the final chapter of the case would always contain some unanswered questions. And perhaps that is the hardest reality of a cold case. Sometimes you can find the person, but you cannot find the reason. You can find the evidence, but you cannot recover every moment. You can correct the record, but you cannot undo the past. Still, the investigation had accomplished something remarkable. It had separated fact from assumption. The 4 men who had been accused were no longer treated as the killers. The forensic evidence had moved the investigation toward Brasher's, and the families finally had a more credible answer than they had possessed for most of their lives. But what happened to the 4 girls remained the heart of the story. Jennifer Harbison was 17. Sarah Harbison was 15. Eliza Thomas was 17. Amy Ayres was 13. Their ages are worth remembering, because when people hear about a famous crime, it can become easy to think about statistics. For victims, 1 crime scene, 1 suspect, 34 years. But those numbers represent human lives. Jennifer had a future. Sarah had a future. Eliza had a future. Amy had a future. All of it disappeared in a matter of hours. Their families were left to continue living without them. And that meant birthdays became painful reminders. Holidays became difficult. Family gatherings had an empty place. The passing years did not erase the loss. Instead, the absence became part of everyday life. Then came the investigations, the arrests, the trials, the appeals, and the long wait. For the families, every new development probably carried hope. Perhaps this was finally the answer. Perhaps the suspect was finally the person responsible. Perhaps the case would finally close. And then in the early years, that hope collapsed. The original convictions were overturned. The case returned to uncertainty. Imagine living through that. Imagine being told that the person responsible had finally been found. Then learning that the conviction could not stand. Then watching the investigation continue for years. And finally, decades later, hearing another name. Robert Eugene Brasher's. The emotional impact must have been enormous. Because even a breakthrough can bring new pain. A name creates new questions. Who was he? Why was he never identified? How did he escape suspicion? Did he know the girls? Did he tell anyone? Was he alone? And why did he die before investigators discovered his connection? The answers to some of those questions may never be known. But investigators have continued examining the evidence. And the evidence is powerful. The DNA connection to Amy Ayres' fingernail evidence was significant. The ballistic evidence added another layer. And Brasher's presence in Austin around the time of the murders provided historical context. Together, these facts created a much stronger picture. Yet the investigators remained cautious. The case was not being treated as a simple solved mystery. It remained open, because the goal was not simply to announce a name. The goal was to understand the crime. That distinction matters. A murder investigation should not end merely because investigators have a strong suspect. There can still be accomplices. There can still be hidden evidence. There can still be witnesses. there can still be information that changes the understanding of the case. And in this case, there was another reason to keep looking. The wrongful convictions. The original investigation had caused enormous harm. 4 men had been accused. 2 were convicted, and their lives were changed forever. Eventually, the courts formally declared them innocent. The city of Austin also moved toward a major settlement related to the wrongful arrests and convictions. The proposed settlement reached up to $35 million, but the money was not the point of the murder investigation. It was part of the story of accountability. The murder investigation was about the victims and the truth. Those two things needed to be separated. The families needed answers. The wrongly accused men needed their names cleared, and investigators needed to determine what had actually happened. Modern DNA evidence helped accomplish all 3 goals. It cleared the old suspects. It pointed toward a new suspect. And it gave investigators a direction that had not existed before. That is the power of forensic evidence. It can remain silent for years. Then suddenly it can transform an entire case. The evidence from the yogurt shop murders had survived the fire. It had survived decades of storage. It had survived changes in investigators. It had survived changes in technology. And eventually, it provided information that investigators in 1991 could not fully access. The killer may have believed that setting the shop on fire would erase the evidence. But the fire could not destroy everything. That is perhaps the most haunting part of the case. The person responsible tried to erase the scene, but the evidence remained, quietly, waiting, and eventually it spoke, not with a voice, not with a confession, but with a genetic profile. That profile eventually led investigators to Brasher's, and suddenly the case had a new center. The man had been dead for years, but his biological evidence remained. That is something criminals cannot always control. A person can disappear. A person can change their name. A person can move to another state. A person can die. But DNA can remain. And sometimes, decades later, it can still tell investigators where to look. The yogurt shop case demonstrates that perfectly. But perhaps the most important part of the modern investigation is not the technology. It is persistence. Someone had to preserve the evidence. Someone had to keep the files. Someone had to continue investigating. Someone had to decide that an old case was worth another look. And someone had to believe that the truth was still there. That belief kept the investigation alive. For decades, the case became part of Austin's history. People grew up knowing about it. New detectives encountered it. Forensic scientists studied it. And families continued to carry it. Then, more than 30 years later, the case finally moved forward. That is an extraordinary amount of time. 34 years is long enough for an entire generation to grow up. A teenager in 1991 could be a parent or even a grandparent by the time the breakthrough came. Technology that seemed like science fiction in 1991 became routine. DNA databases grew. Forensic genealogy developed. Computers became vastly more powerful, and evidence that once seemed limited became increasingly valuable. The case was carried forward by the same basic facts. For girls, 1 yogurt shop, 1 fire, but the tools used to understand those facts had changed completely. That is why cold case investigations are sometimes described as unfinished stories. The ending is not always missing. Sometimes it is simply waiting to be discovered. The yogurt shop case may never have a perfect ending. There may never be a complete explanation of motive. There may never be a confession. There may never be a courtroom verdict against Brasher's. But there is something that did not exist before. A forensic connection, a name, and a stronger understanding of who was not responsible. For the families, that matters. For the wrongly accused men, it matters. And for investigators, it provides a direction. The case can now be remembered differently. Not as a mystery with 4 convicted killers, but as a case in which innocent men were wrongfully accused, while modern evidence eventually pointed toward another suspect. That is an important correction. And perhaps that is what justice means in a case like this. Not perfection, not a dramatic courtroom ending, but truth. The truth that 4 girls were murdered. The truth that innocent men were wrongly accused. The truth that forensic evidence eventually pointed toward Brasher's. And the truth that some questions may never be answered. Sometimes honesty about what remains unknown is itself a form of justice. Because pretending to know something that the evidence cannot prove only creates another false story. Investigators now know more than they did before. But they should not claim to know everything. That is why the case remains open. There may still be more to discover. Someone may still know something. A forgotten detail may still exist. And another scientific breakthrough may someday reveal something that investigators cannot currently see. The possibility remains. And perhaps that is the final message of the yogurt shop murders. Never assume that an old case has nothing left to say. Evidence can wait, science can improve, and truth can survive longer than anyone expects. The girls' families waited through decades of uncertainty. They endured false answers. They endured disappointment. They endured the pain of watching innocent men be accused. And eventually, they received something real. A forensic breakthrough. It was not perfect. It did not bring the girls back. It did not create a trial. It did not answer every question. But it changed the story. And sometimes, changing the story from uncertainty to evidence is an enormous step. The yogurt shop murders will always be remembered for the tragedy that happened inside that small Austin business. But they should also be remembered for what happened afterward. For the families who never stopped asking questions. For the men who fought to prove their innocence. For the investigators who continued searching. And for the evidence that survived long enough to be understood. The case began with a fire. But the fire did not erase everything. It left behind clues. And those clues waited. For years. Then decades. Until modern science finally brought them into focus. The names of the 4 girls remain at the center of the story. Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, Amy. 4 lives. 4 families. One night that changed everything. And a mystery that lasted longer than anyone could have imagined. Today, the case stands in a different place. The original suspects have been cleared. A likely perpetrator has been identified. The investigation remains open. And the evidence continues to tell investigators where to look. Maybe one day, the remaining questions will finally be answered. Maybe someone will come forward. Maybe another piece of evidence will be discovered. Maybe science will reveal something new. Or maybe this is as close to the complete truth as the surviving evidence will ever allow. We simply do not know. But what we do know is enough to change the historical record. The girls were murdered. The men originally convicted were not the killers. And modern forensic evidence has connected Robert Eugene Brasher's to the crime. After more than 3 decades, that is a remarkable development. And perhaps for the families, it is the beginning of a different kind of peace. Not because the pain is gone. It never will be. But because they no longer have to wonder whether the case was completely forgotten. It wasn't. The investigators kept looking. The evidence remained. And eventually the truth came closer. After more than 3 decades, the story of the yogurt shop murders had finally reached a place that once seemed impossible. There was a name. There was forensic evidence. And there was a clearer understanding of what had gone wrong during the original investigation. But there was still no perfect ending. The 4 girls were still gone. The families still had to live with that loss. And the man investigators believed was responsible was no longer alive to answer for what happened. His name was Robert Eugene Brasher's. According to Austin police, modern DNA testing connected him to evidence from the crime scene, including biological material associated with Amy Ayers. Investigators also identified a ballistic connection involving a firearm linked to another murder. Those discoveries changed the case forever. But they also created one final question. What does the truth look like when it arrives 34 years late? Perhaps it looks different from what people imagined. There was no dramatic arrest. No police lights outside a suspect's home. No courtroom confession. No jury. No sentence. Instead, there was science. Evidence that had survived. A DNA profile. A ballistic connection. Old records. And investigators willing to look at the case again. That was the ending this case received. Not the ending anyone would have chosen, but an ending based on evidence. For Jennifer Harbison's family, the years had been filled with memories. For Sarah's family, the same. For Eliza's family. For Amy's family. Every family had its own memories. The girls had lives before the murders. They had childhoods. They had friends. They had ordinary conversations. They had dreams. And then, on one December night in 1991, everything stopped. They went to work. They never came home. That fact has remained unchanged for more than 3 decades. What changed was the understanding of who may have been responsible. At first, investigators believed they had answers. Then those answers collapsed. The men who had been accused fought for years to prove their innocence. Eventually, they were formally cleared. That part of the story is important because it shows how dangerous it can be to confuse a conviction with the truth. A courtroom verdict can be wrong. A confession can be wrong. A witness can be wrong. Investigators can be wrong. But the willingness to keep examining evidence can eventually correct those mistakes. That is what happened here. The case did not stay frozen. It evolved. The technology evolved. And the evidence became more useful. The DNA that could not solve the case in 1991 eventually became one of its most important clues. That is the strange nature of time. The same evidence can mean something completely different 30 years later. In 1991, investigators were looking for a person. In 2025, they could use DNA technology to search for a genetic identity. The difference was enormous. And yet, the evidence itself had not been waiting for technology. It had simply been there, quietly, patiently, preserved, waiting for someone to understand what it could tell them. The case also reminds us that fire cannot always destroy evidence. The killer burned the yogurt shop, but biological evidence survived. Ballistic evidence survived. Records survived. And the memories of the victims survived through their families. The building disappeared, but the story did not. The names did not disappear. The questions did not disappear. And eventually, the evidence led investigators back toward the truth. Still, there are questions that may never be answered. Why did the killer choose the yogurt shop? Why did he target those girls? Was the attack planned? Was there a robbery motive? Was the violence sexually motivated? Why was the building burned? And was Brasher's truly acting alone? Police have said they believe Brasher's was the likely sole perpetrator, but the investigation remains open. That means we should be careful about claiming certainty where the public evidence does not provide it. The evidence points in a powerful direction, but some details remain unknown, and perhaps they always will. That is not a failure of storytelling. It is simply the reality of a case that has survived for more than 30 years. Sometimes the truth is incomplete. Sometimes the person who knows the missing details dies before anyone discovers his connection. And sometimes all investigators can do is get as close as the evidence allows. In this case, they have come much closer. The original suspects were cleared. A new suspect was identified, and the forensic evidence gave investigators something solid to work with. For the families, that may be enough to finally change the question. For decades, the question was, who killed our daughters? Now there is a much more specific answer. The evidence points toward Robert Eugene Brasher's. But another question remains. Why? That question may never have an answer. And perhaps that is the part of the case that families will carry forever. Knowing who may have done something does not always explain why it happened. But perhaps there is another kind of closure. The closure of knowing that the case was not forgotten. The closure of knowing that the wrong men were eventually cleared. The closure of knowing that investigators continued to search. And the closure of knowing that the surviving evidence finally spoke. The 4 girls deserve to be remembered for more than their deaths. Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, Amy. Their lives were more than one terrible night. They were daughters, sisters, friends, teenagers, people with personalities and dreams. The tragedy is not simply that they became victims of a famous crime. The tragedy is that their futures were taken away. They should have grown older. They should have experienced adulthood. They should have celebrated birthdays. They should have watched the world change. They should have lived ordinary lives. Instead, their families had to grow older without them. That is something no investigation can repair. But remembering them can ensure that their lives are not reduced to 4 names in a case file. And perhaps that is the most important thing about telling this story. Not the fire. Not the suspects. Not the courtroom battles. Not even the DNA. The most important thing is remembering the people at the center of it. For young girls who went to work on a December evening. For families who expected them home. And 4 lives that ended far too soon. The yogurt shop murders also left another legacy. The men who were wrongly accused. Their story reminds us that justice requires caution. A police investigation must seek the truth, not simply a conviction. A confession must be tested. Evidence must be examined. And investigators must remain willing to change their minds when new information appears. That is difficult, but it is necessary, because the consequences of getting it wrong can last for decades. The original investigation changed the lives of innocent men. The later forensic evidence helped correct that mistake, and that correction matters. It does not erase the past, but it changes the future. It tells future investigators that old assumptions can be wrong. It tells families that evidence should never be forgotten. And it tells the public that a cold case is not necessarily a dead case. Sometimes the answer is still there, waiting. The yogurt shop murders remained unsolved for more than 30 years. But the case was never completely silent. The evidence was still there. The files were still there. The memories were still there. And the families never stopped remembering. Then, eventually, science provided a new way to listen. A DNA profile, a match, a name, and a new direction. That is how the mystery began to unravel. Not through a dramatic confession, not through a lucky eyewitness, but through evidence that had survived time. And perhaps that is fitting, because the killer tried to destroy the scene. He tried to erase what had happened, but the truth proved harder to destroy. The fire disappeared. The building disappeared. The suspect eventually disappeared, but the evidence remained. And eventually, it brought the investigators back to him. That is where the case stands today. A major breakthrough has occurred. The original suspects have been cleared. A likely perpetrator has been identified. The investigation remains open, and there are still unanswered questions. Maybe one day, someone will come forward. Maybe another piece of evidence will be found. Maybe investigators will discover something hidden in the old records. Or maybe the remaining mysteries will stay mysteries forever. We cannot know, but one thing is certain. The 4 girls will never be forgotten. Their names will remain connected to the story. Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, Amy Ayers. 4 young lives, 4 families, 1 night, and a case that took more than 30 years to move toward the truth. So as we close this story, remember the difference between an ending and an answer. An ending means the story stops. An answer means we understand everything. This case has an ending, but it may never have every answer. And perhaps that is why it has remained so haunting for so long. There are still pieces of that night that belong only to the people who were there. Some of those people are gone. Some memories are gone. Some evidence was destroyed. But enough survived to change the story. Enough survived to clear innocent men. Enough survived to identify a likely perpetrator. And enough survived to tell us that even after 34 years, the truth had not completely disappeared. It was waiting, and eventually investigators found it. The night at the yogurt shop is over. The fire is long gone. The streets of Austin have changed. The world has changed. But the names remain, and so does the memory. For girls went to work. They never came home. For decades, their families waited. And finally, after all those years, science gave investigators something they had been missing since the beginning. A name, a connection, a direction. Perhaps that is the closest thing this case can offer to closure. Not revenge, not a dramatic courtroom ending, but the truth. And sometimes, after decades of darkness, even an incomplete truth can bring a little light.